Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. The hum of the engine grew faint as the ranger's truck rumbled down the narrow, winding mountain road. Beside him, the deep expanse of the Rocky Mountains stretched endlessly, jagged peaks looming like silent sentinels against the sky. It had been a long drive, and the weight of the solitude was beginning to settle in, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. He adjusted his rearview mirror, a last glance at the world he was leaving behind. A thin sliver of twilight was fading behind him. The radio, which had been mostly silent throughout the journey, crackled to life. "Ranger 223, come in." The dispatcher's voice was crisp, professional, a reassuring sound that tugged at the edges of his mind. He was finally here. The station he'd been assigned to was small, isolated, hidden deep within the heart of the park, far from the bustling trails and crowded campgrounds. He'd heard the stories. Who hadn't? A new park ranger was always a target for tales of ghosts, strange creatures, and the unexplainable events that seemed to plague those brave enough, or foolish enough, to venture into the park after dark. But it was a job, and he was trained to handle whatever might come his way. "You'll be alone on this shift, Ranger 223, the dispatcher continued. "The usual crew's on leave, but everything should be quiet. Check in with us every couple of hours, and don't forget, listen for anything unusual on the emergency frequency. You never know what might come through those mountains at night." The ranger nodded, even though he knew the dispatcher couldn't see him. He'd read the notes on his assignment, done the necessary prep work. He was a man of reason, of logic, but the unease that gnawed at the pit of his stomach couldn't be dismissed. The road twisted and turned, the world around him dimming as night fell, the last of the sunlight fading over the mountains, leaving only shadows in its wake. As the truck rounded a bend, the ranger caught sight of the station in the distance, a small cabin surrounded by thick trees that seemed to close in around it. It looked like a relic from another time, old wood weathered by countless seasons, the kind of place that could hide countless secrets. He pulled the truck into the small parking area, the tires crunching against gravel. The air was thick and cold, a biting chill that scraped against his skin like ice. He grabbed his pack and stepped out of the truck, the weight of the night settling in with every step toward the cabin. His boots crunched in the snow as he made his way to the door. The wind howled through the trees, sending a low moan through the branches that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The mountains were watching. Inside, the station was quiet. Too quiet. The faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, mixed with something earthy, almost like the scent of wet stone. The flickering light from an old lamp cast strange shadows on the walls, which seemed to stretch unnaturally, making the small room feel even smaller. The radio sat on the counter, its dials dusty but intact. He ran his hand over the surface, tracing the contours of the ancient machine, and then sat down at the desk. The logbook was open, the pages yellowed with age. He flipped through it absently, scanning the notes left by the previous rangers. Some were routine, others more personal, brief mentions of wildlife sightings, strange weather patterns, even reports of strange sounds late at night. Nothing that would have made him pause, until his eyes fell upon one entry that seemed out of place. "If you hear it, don't answer. Don't look outside." His fingers hovered over the page. The handwriting was messy, frantic. The date was 5 years ago, on this exact night. A shiver ran down his spine. He had heard stories of rangers losing their grip on reality, succumbing to the isolation, but this felt different. He scanned the rest of the entry, but the rest of the words were nothing more than an indecipherable jumble of ink smudges and half-formed thoughts. The warning lingered in his mind, sending a cold ripple through him. His eyes darted to the radio again, now silent. The sense of unease that had been growing since he arrived began to take root. It was as if the air around him had thickened, becoming heavy and oppressive. There was something wrong here, something he couldn't quite place. The world outside felt distant, as though the trees themselves were watching. He felt, for the first time, the weight of being alone in the wilderness. Completely alone. He leaned forward, grabbed the microphone, and keyed the radio. "Ranger 223 calling dispatch. Can you hear me?" A brief moment of silence followed. Then the static crackled to life. "This is dispatch. We copy you, Ranger 223. How's everything out there?" His voice, though steady, felt unnaturally loud in the stillness of the station. "Everything's good, just settling in for the night shift. No issues yet." There was a pause on the other end, the static fading in and out. "All right. Remember, you're on your own out there tonight. Keep an eye on the emergency frequency. We'll check in again in a couple of hours. Stay safe, Ranger." He clicked off the radio, his mind still on that strange entry in the logbook. Why would someone write something like that? "Don't answer, don't look outside." What kind of warning was that? It didn't make sense. There was no history of any incidents at this station, at least none that had made it into the official records. The wind picked up again outside, howling louder than before, but it wasn't the wind that made his stomach twist. It was the thought of that entry. The words replayed over and over in his head like a broken record. What had happened to the ranger who'd written it? Where were they now? As the clock ticked on, the ranger tried to shake off the feeling of unease. It was just nerves, he reasoned. It had to be. There was nothing in the mountains that could harm him. Not here. Not now. But then the radio crackled again. This time, the voice wasn't dispatch. A soft, broken whisper came through the static, faint at first, but unmistakable. "Help me. It's watching me. I can't move." His breath caught in his throat. The voice was distorted, crackling with interference, but there was no mistaking it. It was the unmistakable tone of a person in distress. His pulse quickened. He grabbed the mic again, his hands shaking. "This is Ranger 223. Who is this? Can you hear me?" Nothing. Silence. Just the static. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced at the clock. It was late. Too late for any ranger to be out here, let alone calling for help. He keyed the radio again, voice tight with tension. "This is Ranger 223. I'm here. Where are you?" There was no answer. Just the cold whisper, distorted and broken. "Help me. Please, I can't move." He turned, eyes flicking to the door. The night outside was pitch black. No stars in sight, just the endless sea of shadows. The trees loomed like sentinels, their branches twisted and reaching. His mind raced as the voice repeated itself over and over, trapped in the static. The wind howled louder. Something was wrong. He tried the radio again, voice shaking now. "Who's out there? I'm coming. What's going on?" Still, no response. Only the whisper. The voice seemed to be growing fainter, but more urgent. "I can't move. It's not possible," he thought. "There's no one else out here." Dispatch said no one else was in the area. Then the final words came through, clear as day, breaking through the static like a scream. "Don't answer. Don't look outside." The transmission ended with a sudden, sharp crack, leaving only the eerie silence of the mountains to fill the space. He was left staring at the radio, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind was spinning. This wasn't a prank. It wasn't a malfunction. Something or someone was out there. Something that wanted him to stay inside. Something that didn't want him to look outside. His hands tightened around the microphone, knuckles white. But it was too late. The voice had already started again. The voice had started again. The radio crackled again. The static surged, filling the small ranger station like a dark, oppressive presence. The whisper, distant and muffled, had now become a strange, incoherent jumble of words that twisted and warped like a nightmare trying to escape the static. For a moment, the ranger thought he might have imagined it, but then the faintest trace of a voice emerged, growing clearer as it sliced through the crackling feedback. "It's watching me. Please, help me." The words came so suddenly, so desperately, that his heart lurched in his chest. His fingers tightened around the microphone, his knuckles white. There was no mistaking it this time. This wasn't a glitch or interference. This was a person, someone out there calling for help, trapped. His pulse quickened as he pressed the button. "This is Ranger 223, I'm listening. Can you hear me? Where are you? What's happening?" His voice trembled, a mix of fear and resolve. For a moment, nothing. Only the hollow echo of silence. He waited, every nerve in his body straining with anticipation. Then a faint crackle returned. The words came through slower this time, stretched as though the speaker was in pain, their voice breaking apart with each syllable. "Please, you can't help me. It won't let me move." The ranger's breath caught in his throat. There was a terrible weight to the words, an unbearable sense of helplessness that pressed down on him like a physical force. The message, the desperation, it felt all too real. But even as the words repeated, the static began to distort them, turning them into a grotesque mockery of human speech. "Don't look outside. It's watching." The last part sent a shiver crawling down his spine. His gaze instinctively snapped toward the window. The forest outside was still, too still. The air was unnaturally quiet, the trees unmoving, their skeletal branches etched against the night sky like claws. His eyes flicked back to the radio. No more voice, just the crackling hum of static. His breath was heavy now, his pulse pounding in his ears as the weight of the situation pressed harder. He turned the volume dial, trying to clear up the interference. The harsh noise faded slightly, but the voice had stopped. The echo of those last words, "It's watching," clung to the air, thick and suffocating. Slowly, almost against his will, he turned toward the door. The silence outside felt unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. For a moment he stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. His hand trembled as it hovered near the door handle. Part of him wanted to step outside, to investigate, to do something. But another part of him, the part that remembered the warning in the logbook, wanted to stay inside, to lock the door, to shut the world out. But the voice kept playing in his mind. "Don't look outside." The wind howled again, louder this time, and with it came a series of low, haunting creaks from the trees just outside the station. A chill crawled across his skin, and he shuddered involuntarily. The trees seemed to shift in the darkness, though. He couldn't see their movement. His mind played tricks on him, but his instincts screamed that something wasn't right. He forced himself to turn away from the door. There were more immediate concerns. Who had sent the call? What had happened to them? And why did they sound like they were in such agony? The logbook. He needed to look again, see if there was anything else. The previous ranger's warning echoed in his mind. Don't answer. Don't look outside. He grabbed the logbook, flipping through the pages. But now, the faint sound of something scraping against the window stopped him dead in his tracks. It was a subtle noise, barely audible, but there was no mistaking it. Something was outside. The ranger stiffened, his body locking up as he listened. Scrape, scrape. The noise was slow, deliberate, almost rhythmic, like nails against glass. His gaze shot to the window where the dark, impenetrable night stretched beyond the thin glass. The trees swayed slightly in the wind, but he could see nothing. Nothing but shadows. He walked slowly toward the window, trying to remain calm. His breath was shallow, his heart racing in his chest as he approached the glass. As he neared, he could see his own reflection faintly in the window's surface. His eyes were wide, his face pale. Scrape, scrape. The sound came again, louder this time. The scraping moved in a slow, deliberate motion, coming from somewhere outside. His hand hovered over the blinds, but fear held him back. "Don't look outside." The voice whispered again, unbidden, like a warning from the darkest part of his mind. He couldn't help it. He needed to know. What was out there? With a trembling hand, he pulled the blinds open just slightly, just enough to get a glimpse. The cold, bitter wind rushed in, and for a split second, he could see nothing but the thick expanse of trees and the inky blackness between them. The shadows shifted in strange ways, too far apart, too disconnected, as if the darkness itself were moving. He squinted, trying to make sense of the shapes, but there was nothing there. Nothing that could explain the sound. But then, a figure. It was fleeting, barely visible through the shadows, tall, thin, unnatural. It was there, and then it was gone, swallowed by the forest in an instant. But for that one terrible moment, he had seen it. Or had he? His heart thundered in his chest, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. His breath came in shallow gasps. He jerked the blinds shut, the movement sharp and frantic. He backed away from the window, his mind scrambling to process what he had just seen or thought he had seen. It was gone. Whatever it was gone. But the unsettling sense of being watched remained. The radio crackled again, slicing through the thick silence. He almost didn't want to answer, but he had to know. Was anyone else out there? He snatched the microphone. "Ranger 223 to dispatch. Do you copy?" Silence. Nothing but the static hummed on the other end. He pressed the button again. "Dispatch, come in. I've got a situation here. Are you receiving me?" But the radio remained silent. No reply. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the silence stretched on. The pressure inside the station grew unbearable. The isolation was suffocating. He stared at the radio for a moment, wondering if he was losing his mind. But then the voice returned, faint and distorted, as though it had been waiting, lingering in the static. "It's still out there. It's coming. It's watching." He felt his stomach drop. The voice was no longer a plea. It was a warning. And then the final horrific words echoed through the static. "You can't escape." The words reverberated in the ranger's mind like the toll of a distant bell, growing louder, clearer with every passing second. You can't escape. They weren't just a warning. They were a promise. His fingers trembled around the radio, microphone, but no other words came through. Silence. The static buzzed, leaving only the oppressive weight of the night in the room. The temperature seemed to drop, the air growing colder by the second. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from the mountain's altitude. It was an unnatural chill seeping into his bones, as if the very atmosphere had turned hostile. For a long moment the ranger stood frozen, staring at the radio in disbelief. His mind raced, his heart pounded against his chest, the blood rushing in his ears. Was it a prank? A malfunction? No, he knew deep down that something far worse was at play here. Something is out there. The dark shapes outside the window seemed to dance in his peripheral vision, stretching and warping in the shadows. He couldn't look back. He couldn't afford to see it again. The mere thought of it, the unnatural figure he had glimpsed for that split second, made his skin crawl. The wind had stopped. The silence outside was profound now, but it was the kind of silence that felt wrong. It pressed against the walls of the cabin, suffocating the air. The forest had gone still. The trees no longer swayed in the wind, not a single rustling leaf, just stillness, and then scrape. It came again, the sound of nails or claws dragging along the surface of the cabin, slowly, methodically, scrape, scrape, scrape. This time, it wasn't coming from the window. The sound came from behind him. A sharp, cold wave of dread swept over him as he turned slowly, his gaze shifting toward the corner of the room. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, long, creeping across the walls, pooling like liquid blackness in the dim light. His breath caught in his throat. The air grew heavier, as though something ancient and suffocating was pressing down on him. The very fabric of reality felt fragile, like it might tear at any moment. He took a step back, his foot brushing against something, a small object that had been knocked to the floor. He glanced down, his pulse quickening. It was a photo frame, but not just any photo frame. It was old, cracked, and the picture inside had faded with time. But what disturbed him most was the image. It was of the station from years ago, when it had first been built. A group of rangers stood around it, smiling, their faces frozen in time. But there was one detail that stopped him cold. In the background, barely visible, stood a figure, tall, thin, unnatural, a shadow among shadows. The figure's outline was so faint, so subtle that he had almost missed it. But now that his eyes had locked onto it, he couldn't look away. It was the same figure he had seen in the forest earlier. The realization hit him like a physical blow. It's been here before. This wasn't the first time someone had been trapped. In this station, haunted by this thing. He grabbed the photo frame, his breath shallow and ragged, his hands trembling as he set it aside. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Could this be some kind of ghost? A curse? Or something worse, something older, something that had been feeding off the fear of every ranger who had come here before? He needed answers. But the logbook, the last entry, had been so cryptic, and the radio only gave him more questions. There had to be more, something buried in the past, something that could explain what was happening. As if on cue, the radio crackled again, interrupting his thoughts. This time, the voice was clearer, but it was different. The static had thinned, revealing a low, guttural growl that carried with it an unmistakable sense of menace. "I can't move." The ranger's heart skipped a beat. He knew that voice. It was the same one from before, the one pleading for help. But this time, it was different. This time, there was something wrong with the voice. It wasn't just desperation. It was filled with a deep, gnawing fear. It was as if the speaker was struggling to hold on to their humanity. "I'm right behind you." The voice rasped. His spine went rigid. Slowly, ever so slowly, he turned. He didn't want to. He didn't dare. But some primal instinct pushed him, forcing him to face what was behind him. The room was still. Too still, nothing. No figure, no shape in the shadows, just the walls, the floor, and the stillness. But that didn't make him feel any better. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he stepped backward toward the door, his mind screaming that he needed to leave. But the door wouldn't open. His hand gripped the handle and he twisted it, but the door was stuck, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. Scrape. 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 This time it was louder. Closer. His stomach dropped. A shadow passed in front of the small, dust-covered window by the door. He froze, staring at it with wide eyes, unable to move. It's out there. The thought tore through him, a cold knife of terror. The figure from the window was now outside. The door, its presence palpable, like a thick fog creeping into the room. Suddenly the radio crackled again. The same low, guttural growl. But this time it wasn't a voice, it was something else. A growl that rumbled deep in the static, a sound so primal that it seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the ranger. And then, amidst the static, the voice returned, no longer pleading, no longer terrified. It was cold, controlled. You're not alone anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. His mind spun, heart hammering in his chest. The growling had stopped, but now there was something worse. A presence, something he couldn't see, but he could feel it. The weight of its eyes on him, pressing against his skin. The air inside the cabin felt thick, saturated with dread. The shadows in the corners of the room were alive now, twisting, growing. He couldn't tell where they ended and where the darkness began. The very space around him felt wrong, as though the walls themselves were closing in, shifting with unseen force. The radio crackled one last time, but the voice was no longer distorted. It was clear. Look outside. His breath hitched, his pulse racing. The voice was no longer a warning. It was an order. The ranger stood motionless, frozen in place. The door, the window, the radio, it was all pulling him in, dragging him toward the inevitable. Something wanted him to look outside. Something wanted him to see. He knew what he had to do, but he was terrified to find out what would happen if he did. Look outside. The words rang in his ears like a curse. Look outside. He stared at the door, his heart thumping painfully in his chest, each beat a countdown. His hand clutched the doorknob as though it were his only anchor to the world outside the station. Look outside. The voice had been so clear, so insistent. There was no room for hesitation now. He had to face it. He had no choice. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his body trembled with the cold sweat of terror. The radio sat on the desk, still crackling with static, the last words lingering in the air like a shadow that refused to leave. Slowly, he backed away from the door, his eyes never leaving the dark window next to it. Something was out there. Something that had been watching him, and something that wanted him to look. His legs felt weak, as if the floor itself might give way beneath him. Yet, against every instinct screaming inside him, he approached the window. The glass was cool beneath his fingers as he touched it. His reflection stared back at him, distorted by the thickness of the grime covering the surface. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. But something was off about the way he looked. His face seemed too drawn, too gaunt. The reflection in the window. It wasn't quite right. He squinted at his own image, the edges of his face blurred by the dirt on the glass. But then something made him recoil. He hadn't moved, but his reflection seemed to shift. The eyes in the glass, they were no longer his. For a brief moment, they were too wide, darker, hollow. He gasped, stumbling backward. His heart hammered in his chest as he glanced nervously around the room. His reflection had changed, but there was no one else here. No one had moved. There was no one else. He pressed his palms against the window, willing himself to focus, to stay grounded. Then the scraping sound returned. This time, it wasn't a distant noise, it was right outside the glass. He could feel the vibration in the air as the sharp nails, or claws, scratched across the window pane, slow and deliberate. His breath hitched in his throat as the shadows around the window darkened, thickening as though they were being pulled from all sides, engulfing the edges of the glass. His hands shook uncontrollably. He didn't want to look, he didn't want to face it, but the pull was undeniable. Look outside. His fingers curled around the blinds, the fabric cold against his skin. His stomach twisted in knots, and for a brief second, he wondered if he was losing his mind. He glanced down at the radio again. No help there. No answers. Nothing but static. The claws scratched again, louder this time. a series of harsh, jagged movements that seemed to scrape at his very soul. Unable to resist, he yanked the blinds open with a swift motion. For a long moment, there was nothing but darkness outside. Then, a movement. Something slender. The figure. It was standing just outside. The window so close that its outline blurred against the glass. The silhouette was tall, impossibly tall, with long, elongated limbs that twisted at unnatural angles. It was like a shadow, but it wasn't a shadow. The darkness clung to it as though it were part of the creature itself, making it hard to focus, hard to define. It wasn't human. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, the neck snapping with a sickening crack as it stared at him through the window with hollow, unblinking eyes. It knew he was watching. His breath caught in his throat, his hands trembling violently as he stumbled backward, his mind refusing to comprehend what he had just seen. The figure outside didn't move. It stood perfectly still, as if waiting for something. Waiting for him. A thick, low growl echoed from somewhere within the figure's body, reverberating through the glass, vibrating the air around him. It was a sound like metal scraping against stone, unnatural. The growl was deep, resonating with a hunger that sent cold tendrils of fear crawling up his spine. But then, it blinked. The eyes, those hollow, endless eyes, blinked once, then twice. It was slow, almost too slow, like a spider preparing to strike. And in that moment, he felt something shift deep within him. The creature wasn't just looking at him, it was looking into him, it was feeling him, and it knew everything he had ever feared. The ranger backed away from the window, his heart slamming against his rib cage. Every instinct told him to run. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to flee, to escape, to get out. But the door was still stuck. The walls of the cabin were closing in. The shadows, those dark shapes in the corners of the room, seemed to be growing, pulling toward him like they were alive, hungry for his fear. The growl from outside grew louder, and for a brief moment, the ranger swore he heard it laugh, a deep, guttural sound, like a cruel echo reverberating through the cabin. It wasn't just a creature. It wasn't just some figment of his imagination. The thing outside the window was part of this place. It had been here before, and it would be here again. It was tied to the forest, to the station, to everything that had happened in these woods. Suddenly the creature moved. It was fast, too fast. Its limbs contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible as it lurched forward, its body twisting, like some grotesque marionette. The figure slammed against the glass with a sound that was half screech, half thud. The impact rattled the window, shaking the entire cabin. The figure pressed its face against the glass, its breath misting up the window in a swirl of frost, and then its lips parted, not in a smile, but something much worse. It was a slow, mocking gesture, as if savoring the terror it had caused. The air inside the cabin grew impossibly cold. His breath hung in the air, misting like smoke, and then, with an eerie slowness, the figure whispered, "You can't run," it hissed, its voice a rasping, guttural sound. It was as if the very earth beneath him trembled with the force of its words, "You are mine." The whisper lingered in the air long after the figure had spoken. It was as if the very room had absorbed the words, their chilling weight pressing down on him like a 1,000-ton stone. "You are mine." His knees gave way beneath him. The coldness in the air, the frost creeping over the edges of the glass, was suddenly overwhelming, like an icy hand clutching his chest. He gasped for breath, but the air felt too thick, too heavy. This isn't just a creature, he realized with sickening clarity. It's something older, something bound to this place. The ranger stumbled backward, his mind racing, his thoughts no longer coherent. The thing outside, the watcher, wasn't just hunting him. It was part of the land. part of the very earth itself. The station had been built on cursed ground. The mountains had been home to horrors long before human settlers arrived, and the forest had watched as each new ranger came and went. It wasn't just waiting for him. It had been waiting for all of them. He staggered to the corner of the room, clutching his chest as if trying to hold his heart together, feeling the weight of his own terror threatening to crush him. Get a grip. You can get out of this. But those thoughts were faint whispers against the rising tide of panic. His reflection in the window was still there, staring back at him with hollow eyes. The shadows seemed to grow darker with each passing moment, as if they had absorbed the creature's essence. Look outside. The words played over and over in his mind, mocking him, daring him to make the final step. The creature was still there, its dark silhouette pressed against the glass, and he could feel it pulling at him, like it was trying to reach him, not just through the window but through the walls of his own mind. For a moment, he thought he could hear something. Not from outside, but from within. A soft murmur, low and almost indistinguishable, like a distant voice from a dream. Help me. The voice was so faint, so distant. He wasn't sure if it was real, or if his mind was breaking under the pressure. But there was something in it, something familiar. His hands trembled as he grabbed the radio again, dialing in the frequency. Please. The voice again, just a whisper. It was the voice from before. It was the other ranger. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a call for help anymore. It was a plea, a warning. He pressed the microphone to his lips, choking back the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. Who's there? His voice cracked, his own desperation bleeding through. The radio crackled in response, but no coherent words emerged, only that low, guttural growl, the growl that came from the creature outside. He could hear the rasp of its breath, the way it reverberated through the static, like a beast that hadn't tasted flesh in centuries. The growl was closer this time, almost like it was in the room with him. He turned the volume up, frantically, searching for any sign of human voice, anything that would help him understand what was happening. Please, please, don't look. The words were faint, so faint. The voice was trembling, filled with such overwhelming fear that it was impossible to ignore. The radio continued to crackle, the words breaking apart as static ate at them, but he could still hear the unmistakable dread in the voice, the previous ranger's final warning. If you hear it, don't answer. Don't look outside. But it was too late. He had already looked. And now the creature had him in its grasp. Not physically, not yet, but it was inside his head, inside his soul. His chest tightened, his breath shallow and erratic. The air in the room grew suffocating, oppressive, as if the shadows themselves were moving in closer. Every corner of the cabin seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the dark shapes in the room now crawling toward him, stretching and writhing like serpents in the dark. And then the walls began to bleed. Not blood, not exactly. It was darker than blood, thick and tar-like, pooling at the baseboards. The black substance seemed to ooze from the very bones of the cabin, seeping into the floor, into the walls, spreading like some kind of disease. The pungent, foul odor filled his nostrils, and he gagged as the stench suffocated him. His eyes darted around the room, his mind splintering. Was this real? Was it the creature's power? Or had he lost his mind entirely? The walls had become a grotesque mirror of the forest outside. He could almost see faces in the darkness, whispers, screams, memories of rangers who had come before him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. There was no escape, no way out. And then, the scratching. It was louder now. The claws, or whatever they were, scraping against the walls inside the cabin, as if the thing was reaching for him from every corner. The darkness thickened, moving like liquid through the room, swallowing up the floorboards. and crawling toward him like some kind of sentient nightmare. He fell to his knees, clutching his head, the pressure inside his skull growing unbearable. His thoughts were no longer his own. They were warped by the creature's presence, its malevolent influence twisting his mind. It was whispering to him, promising him things, telling him things. "You're the last," it hissed, its voice coming not from the radio, but from inside his very skull, the last to fall. His mind was unraveling. It was too much terror, too much darkness. He wanted to scream, to shout for help, but there was no help. He was alone in the wilderness, in the heart of this cursed station, with nothing but his fear and the watcher outside. And then he saw it, the reflection in the window. But this time, it wasn't just the creature's dark silhouette. It was him, his own reflection. It was smiling. His breath caught in his throat as he staggered backward, his legs giving way beneath him. His reflection stood in the window, grinning, a wide, horrifying grin that stretched unnaturally across his face. But it wasn't his face. It was the face of the creature. The thing outside was wearing his skin. "You are mine," it whispered again, this time not through the radio, but directly into his mind. There is no escape. The blood in his veins turned to ice. His reflection raised its hand, his hand, and, slowly, deliberately, pressed against the glass, and as he looked closer, he realized the truth. The watcher wasn't outside. It had always been inside him. There is no escape. The creature's face, the twisted, grotesque reflection in the window, grinned back at him, a sickening mockery of his own. The skin of his face had been stretched too thin, the eyes wide and hollow, the mouth contorted into a smile so unnatural it made his stomach churn. The warmth of his blood felt cold as ice now, every inch of his body frozen in terror. But there was something else, something deeper within him, a tremor, not of fear, but of understanding. It had always been inside. The creature's whisper echoed in his mind, each word like a brand searing through his consciousness. "You are mine." No. The ranger stumbled back, his legs weak beneath him as he collapsed against the wall, the cabin's oppressive cold wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. His heart raced, his pulse erratic, as he fought against the pull of whatever twisted force had been leaching from the very walls of the station. His hands trembled violently as they pressed against his ears, trying to block out the voice that had seeped inside him like poison. It had been here before. It had been here, waiting. The first call, the distress signal he'd received earlier, wasn't just a warning. It was a trap, a test. It was a summons for the next victim, the next soul to be claimed. And now, he was the one it sought. Outside, the growling intensified, deepening into a guttural roar that shook the very foundations of the cabin. It wasn't the same sound. This time it felt hungry, raw. The creature's hunger wasn't just for flesh, it was for the very essence of the ranger's being. The more he resisted, the more it craved him. He wanted to scream, to fight back. But there was no way to fight something that was a part of him. The realization came crashing over him like a flood. It wasn't just this station that had been cursed. It was the land itself, the very mountains and forests that surrounded him. The Watcher had been there, waiting for generations. It was an ancient spirit, a presence tied to the earth, to the blood spilled over centuries of death and fear. And the Ranger? He was just the latest in a long line. With shaking hands, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out the logbook. His me. Breath caught in his throat as he flipped to the last entry. His entry. The entry that had mirrored the other Ranger's words from 5 years ago. The words were still there, scrawled across the page as though they had been written by someone else. A ghost, a shadow, a reflection of the creature itself. If you hear it, don't answer. Don't look outside. But the ranger had answered. He had looked. The growl outside grew louder, the sound of claws scraping against the wood of the cabin now replaced by a heavy, thudding movement. The creature had begun to circle. It was no longer waiting. It was closing in. "You are mine," it whispered again, its voice now a chorus of voices, each one distorted, stretching across dimensions of sound. "You are the last to fall." His hand shook as the truth washed over him. There was only one way out, only one thing he could do to survive. He had to sacrifice, to give something that would sever the tie between himself and the Watcher. A soul for a soul. He had heard the stories before, but now, in the deepest pit of his terror, he understood. The creature had been feeding on the souls of rangers for centuries, and now it wanted his, the last one left. No, not this time. His heart pounded in his chest, a beat that thundered in his ears, louder and louder as he struggled to stand. The shadows around him grew heavier, more oppressive. He couldn't run. The walls were closing in. The creature was already inside him. He had to make a choice. In a final desperate act, he grabbed the radio again, holding the microphone to his lips. His voice trembled as he whispered into it, the words nearly choking him. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I've done. Don't come back. Don't answer the call." The static on the radio grew louder, a cacophony of distorted voices, and then suddenly there was silence. And in that silence, he could hear it. The Watcher's growl, closer now, pressing against the glass of the station. The ranger's reflection in the window stared back at him, but now it was different. His eyes were no longer hollow. They were his eyes, alive, filled with dread. The creature outside was growing desperate. It was straining to get in. He could hear it scraping at the door, its claws dragging against the wood, relentless. Its twisted, long fingers slipped through the cracks, but there was no way in. The cabin had been sealed. He had sealed it himself, knowing the price he had to pay. He would not leave. He could not. The price of his survival had been set. And so, the ranger made the ultimate sacrifice. He closed his eyes. The air inside the station grew thick, heavy with the weight of his final act. The frost on the window seemed to freeze in place. The air itself was suffused with something old, ancient, something that had been here long before him. He felt the creature pull at him, its claws inside his mind, its cold fingers curling around his soul. But he was ready. The walls of the cabin were alive with the whisper of old spirits, and he embraced them. They would be the final refuge. His last act was to surrender himself entirely, to break the bond between his soul and the creature's, to give up what remained of him. And just before everything went black, before the creature could pull him into the darkness, he heard one last whisper. "Thank you." The final whisper. "Thank you." And with that, the ranger is gone. His final act, a tragic, powerful sacrifice, has sealed his fate, and the creature's power has been broken for now. But the land remains cursed, the Watcher waiting in the shadows for the next soul to answer its call. The cold air inside the station never lifted, though the frost on the windows had begun to crack, sending sharp, jagged fractures through the thick layer of ice. The walls, once thick with shadows, now seemed to breathe, a slow, undulating rhythm that didn't match the pulse of the wind outside. It was as if something new had settled here, something born of the ranger's sacrifice, an unknown presence that hung in the air like smoke. The world outside remained silent, the forest and mountains eerily still, as though they had drawn back, afraid of what had just occurred within the walls of the station. The ground outside remained frozen, the air heavy, the moonlight casting an unnatural glow over the landscape. Even the wind seemed afraid to stir, Yet within the ranger station, the atmosphere had thickened. The station, once a cold but manageable isolation, had taken on a malevolent quality. The air was thick, saturated with something intangible, something older than the creature that had stalked him. It's not over. That was the first thought that struck the moment the last breath of life had slipped from his body. It wasn't the Watcher that was the true threat. No, the creature was just a
vessel.
The true horror was the land itself, the soul of the mountains, the forest, the very earth beneath his feet. The creature was tied to the park, just as the ranger was, just as all the rangers had been. The curse was not just a haunting, it was the land. And now, the Watcher had morphed. It was no longer an entity, it was a force that shifted, that wove itself into the fabric of this world and the next. The first sign of this change came as the dawn began to break, casting pale light over the snowy peaks and through the frosted windows of the ranger station. The early morning was thick with an almost oppressive quiet, but it was the soft sound of footsteps that drew the ranger's partner's attention, and yet the sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was outside. It wasn't the wind. The footsteps were too deliberate, too heavy, almost lumbering. A slow, creeping sound, like someone or something was dragging their feet through the snow, leaving deep, uneven prints in the freshly fallen powder. The footsteps circled the station, drawn in an unnatural pattern, moving deliberately from window to window. Then they stopped, right outside the ranger station's back door. Silence. And then, the unmistakable sound of scraping, a sharp, harsh noise like claws scraping against wood. But this time, it wasn't the Watcher outside. No, this sound was far worse. It wasn't a creature dragging itself. It was something far older, something far more human. Suddenly, the front door of the station creaked. The heavy door seemed to bow as though it were under pressure from something. Massive on the other side, it wasn't a knock, it was a pounding. But the pounding was muted, like a distant echo that felt too close. The ranger's partner, a woman who had recently been assigned to the station, stood frozen in the small office, a hand over her mouth, as she watched the door rattle in its frame. She wasn't new to strange occurrences. She had worked in the park long enough to have heard the tales from old rangers, the warnings passed down like folklore. But this was different. This was not some whispered tale of an old myth. This was something that bled through the cracks of the world. As the door continued to shudder, the logs in the fire pit crackled, popping like the bones of something ancient. She didn't move. She couldn't. The pounding grew louder, more desperate. It felt as though whatever was outside was not only trying to break in, it was trying to break through time itself. The door itself seemed to bend with each thud, warping in a way it should not have. The wood splintered and cracked, and through the broken slats, she saw it. A hand, but not just any hand. The fingers were long, too long, curled unnaturally, the joints snapping with every twitch. The skin was blackened, aged, as though the hand had been buried underground for centuries. It reached toward the door, scratching the cracks as though testing them, like a prisoner searching for a way out of its cage. But it wasn't the skin of the Watcher, nor was it any human form. This hand, with its grotesque fingers, was the last relic of the creature, the true force of the land itself, the one that had only pretended to be bound by the ranger's death. And it was still hungry. The silence that followed was deafening. The hand stilled. The heavy breathing on the other side of the door seemed to fade into the walls themselves. The air hung thick with dread, yet the pressure of whatever was waiting outside seemed to grow, heavier, as if it had sensed that someone had noticed. This place was never just a station. It was never just a job. It was a doorway. The door shuddered again, but this time, it wasn't the pounding of the creature. This time, it was the sound of movement inside the walls themselves. A rattling, a rustling, the feeling of something ancient stretching and writhing in the bones of the cabin. Something was waking up. The woman didn't know what to do. She couldn't understand how to fight this, how to run. The very air in the station thickened, the walls breathing in a way that felt like the lungs of the land itself. And then the whisper came. But this time, it was in her head. "You are the last." The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, the foundations of the cabin groaning as though it was shifting toward a precipice. The whispers grew louder, blending together in a maddening chorus of voices. "You are the last." But she couldn't answer. The whispers had never stopped since the ranger's death, but now they had multiplied. The land had absorbed the sacrifice, twisted it, turned it into something more than just a ghost. She turned to the radio, her hands shaking as she grabbed the receiver. Her heart raced as she punched in the frequency. "Help. Please." Her voice cracked, her words trembling in the thick, suffocating air. The only sound that answered her was a slow, deliberate breath. Then the faintest crackle of the static. Then she heard it. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I've done. Don't come back. Don't answer the call." It was the last thing she heard before the cabin's walls seemed to close in on her, the crushing weight of the land finally overwhelming her. The radio died, and outside the hand on the door slowly stretched. "You are the last." And with this, the story deepens further into the heart of the curse. The woman's discovery has unearthed more than she bargained for. The station isn't just haunted, it is a conduit, a focal point for the dark forces of the land. As the last to enter, she has unknowingly sealed her fate. Will she make the same choices as the ranger, or will she find a way to break the cycle? The land itself was awake now, restless and ravenous. Beneath the layers of snow and the quiet, pristine forests, something ancient stirred, like the rumbling of the earth itself, shaking with the memory of centuries of death, grief, and forgotten sacrifices. Inside the ranger station, the woman, stricken with the weight of the entity's presence, fumbled with the radio in her hands, her body numb with fear. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as she pressed the receiver to her lips once more. Her heart pounded in her chest, a beat she could feel in the walls. But the radio crackled and hissed. No answer, no guidance. The darkness outside pressed against the glass, its very presence suffocating. Her fingers gripped the receiver tighter, but the static was overwhelming now, blurring the line between sanity and madness. And then, through the buzzing storm of static, a voice. It was faint, like a memory. It was almost too quiet to hear, but it was there. "Help me." The words were barely audible. They were a scream swallowed by time, the voice distorted by the airwaves, and yet the woman knew. She had heard those words before. "Who is this?" Her voice cracked. Was it him, the other ranger, the one who had left the cryptic message in the logbook 5 years ago? The same one whose last words had haunted her? The voice on the radio answered. It was soft but desperate. "I can't move. It's here." Her stomach dropped. The voice was his. It was the same call, the same plea. She could feel her pulse quicken, her throat dry as dust. No. This couldn't be happening. The ranger had died. He had made his sacrifice. The last entry in the logbook had confirmed it. The static grew louder, louder, until it filled her ears entirely, like the buzzing of 1,000 flies. The voice faltered, broken by the jagged noise. But then, through the chaos, one word stood out, unmistakable. "It's inside." The radio flickered and popped, and then it fell silent. The cabin felt suffocating now, the air thick with unseen pressure. Outside, the wind began to howl, but not in the natural way of a mountain breeze. No, this was different, too different. The wind screamed against the walls, a banshee wail that rattled the windows, as if something from beyond was testing its hold. The very foundation of the cabin seemed to groan under the weight of it. The shadows inside the station had taken on a life of their own, crawling along the walls like fingers reaching for the woman. She could feel their cold presence creeping down her spine, their chilling breath brushing against her skin. The cabin had become a tomb, a place where the air itself was stained with centuries of lost souls. The whisper came again. Not from the radio this time, but from inside the walls. You are the last. The last. The words were both a threat and a promise. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the overturned chair as she moved toward the window. Her eyes darted toward the frosted glass, her breath fogging up the panes. She could see nothing. The night had swallowed everything whole. No movement, no life, just the silent weight of the land pressing down. Yet there was something out there. She couldn't explain it, but the cold from outside seemed to push its way through the very air in the room. The frost had formed strange patterns on the glass, twisting in ways that made her feel as though the very earth beneath her feet was pulling at her. Suddenly there was a knock at the door, a slow, deliberate knock. It was not the wind. The woman froze, her hand still gripping the edge of the table as the knock sounded again, then a third time. And each time, the knock grew louder, harder, more desperate. She swallowed, her throat dry. She had to get out of there. She had to leave before whatever had claimed the ranger found her. But her legs felt heavy, as if the very floor was holding her in place. The urge to move was swallowed by the terror in her chest, and for a moment she stood paralyzed, caught between two realities, the old ranger's fate and the horrifying unknown that was coming for her now. The knock came again. This time, she could feel it. The door was breathing. The land was alive. The very wood seemed to shudder, groaning with an ancient life of its own. The woman stumbled forward, her hand stretching toward the door, feeling the heat radiating from it, despite the cold that had overtaken the room. Before she could reach the handle, the door slammed open with a force that rattled the entire cabin. The woman was thrown backward, crashing into the chair behind her. She gasped, her heart seizing as she scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide in disbelief. Through the open door she saw nothing but the trees, the endless dark woods stretching out before her. The night had deepened, but it was the woods that held her attention. The trees, gnarled and twisted, stood in perfect stillness. Their branches reached toward the sky like the fingers of ancient forgotten gods. And there, just beyond the threshold of the station, a figure. At first she thought it was a shadow. But no, it was much more than that. The figure was hunched, its body covered in tattered, ragged cloth. It wore no face, only a dark void where its head should have been. The figure's body writhed and shifted as though it could never be still, always moving. But there was no sound. The woman took a step back, her breath caught in her throat. It was the Watcher. It had finally found her. "It's not over, you know," the voice whispered. But it didn't come from the figure. It came from the very ground beneath her feet. The woman stumbled backward, her eyes wide in terror as she realized the truth. The Watcher had never been a creature. It was the land itself. The ancient force had morphed, and now it had claimed her, just as it had claimed the others. It wasn't seeking one soul, it was seeking all of them. And with each new sacrifice, the land grew stronger. The Watcher, now more than just a beast, stepped forward, its long fingers stretching toward her, toward her soul. The woman could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of inevitability pressing down on her. She could not escape the grasp of the land. Her voice, hoarse from the terror, barely escaped her lips. "What do you want from me?" But the Watcher didn't answer. It didn't need to. The answer was in the land, in the echo of its ancient hunger. It had always been watching, and now it was waiting for its final sacrifice. The echo of the land. As the darkness closes in, the woman realizes the horrifying truth. The Watcher is not just a being, but a force that has always existed. Within the land itself, the sacrifices are not just about feeding, it's about maintaining the balance, and this force must never be allowed to rest. With every soul it claims, it grows stronger. She is the last to enter this cycle, but will she be the last to fall? The air in the cabin was thick now, saturated with the smell of damp earth, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the moisture from the forest outside. But the smell wasn't just soil, it was decay, the scent of ancient rot that had been buried beneath layers of snow, forgotten by time, only to surface now in the most grotesque of forms. The station itself groaned like an old, dying animal, its bones creaking under the weight of something far too old to be contained within these walls. The Watcher stood at the door, its form more than just a figure now. It was the forest. Its body was a mesh of gnarled roots and twisted branches, moving in and out of the shadows, shifting with an unnatural fluidity. The ragged cloth that hung from its frame fluttered like torn leaves in the wind, though there was no breeze. Its face, or rather the absence of one, seemed to pull her gaze in as if it was drawing her into that void, that endless, suffocating darkness that stretched farther than the eye could see. She knew without a doubt that it wasn't just here to take her. It was waiting for her to choose. Her hands shook, the radio still in her grasp. But the static on the device was no longer chaotic. It was purposeful. A rhythmic pulse, like the heartbeat of the land itself, reverberated through the small cabin. With each crackle of the static, she felt it grow stronger. The Watcher wasn't just tied to the forest anymore, it was tied to her. And it was waiting for her to make the ultimate decision. The land had been hungry, desperate for more, but it wasn't the creatures of the woods that fed it. No, it was the rangers, the caretakers, the watchers of the park, who had unknowingly fed it for centuries, and now it was her turn. "Please, I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely rising above the static. The words felt too small, too weak for the horror that had surrounded her. The Watcher moved, its shape becoming more solid as it took a step toward her. Each movement it made caused the walls to groan, as though the entire station was shuddering at its presence. The door slammed shut behind it, cutting off her only escape. She was trapped, cornered, and the creature before her was not a beast. It wasn't a demon or a ghost. It was a force, a reflection of the land's insatiable hunger. The Watcher had never been alive. It had always existed. It was an extension of the land itself, growing and shifting with each passing century, always taking, always needing. The woman's breath came in short bursts, each inhale stinging her lungs. She could feel the weight of the air pressing against her chest, as though the land itself was squeezing the life from her. The ground under her feet seemed to pulse, a steady throb that resonated in her bones. The Watcher tilted its head as if considering her. Its form swayed, limbs twisting unnaturally, the tree-like tendrils that hung from its body rattling like chains. And then it spoke. The voice, low and guttural, was not of any language the woman knew, but the meaning was clear. The Watcher didn't need words to communicate. It spoke through the very fabric of the land, through the pulse beneath her feet. But this time its message was plain. "You are the last. She stumbled back, her legs shaking beneath her. "What do you want from me?" Her voice was barely a whisper, cracked with fear. The creature didn't answer at first, but the static grew louder, the crackling hiss rising to a deafening roar. Her head was spinning as the walls of the station seemed to melt into the forest outside. It was like she could see the trees stretching toward her, their dark branches curling like fingers reaching for her skin. The Watcher wasn't just a creature of the land, it was the land itself, and it was inside her, feeding off her fear, her confusion. She could feel its eyes, if they existed, on her, watching, just as it always had. The radio crackled again, and this time, it wasn't the Watcher that spoke. It was the voice of the dead ranger, the one who had gone before her. "You can't escape it. No one can. The land chooses. It has always chosen." Her heart stopped. The message, the same message she had heard so many times before, echoed through her mind, a terrible truth that reverberated deep into her soul. The park had claimed the rangers. One by one, it had consumed them, leaving only their echoes behind. The logbook, the radio transmissions, the warnings left behind. Those were not just messages from the past. They were the voices of those who had been taken. They had not been killed by the creature. They had been absorbed into the land, swallowed by the ancient force that lay beneath it. The land was alive. The land was watching. The land would never stop, and the land wanted her. The truth crushed her chest. She staggered back, hands gripping her throat, as if she could push the words out, as if she could deny them. But she couldn't. It was too late. The Watcher moved toward her, its tendrils reaching. The cold air swirled around her, sharp like knives against her skin, but it was not the cold she feared. It was the silence that followed. The absence of noise, the absence of air. It was the land drawing in its breath, preparing for the final sacrifice. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. She was trapped in a cycle, an endless loop. The Watcher was not the end. The Watcher was the beginning. The Watcher was the land, and the land had always been watching. There was a final moment of clarity, a brief understanding of the horrific choice that lay before her. She could fight. She could scream. But it wouldn't matter. The sacrifice had already been made. She was already part of it. The Watcher reached out, its branches now fully extended, their razor-sharp edges glistening in the fading light. She could feel its cold presence inside her, in her mind, in her soul. The land had already begun to consume her, and in this moment she realized that she was never meant to survive. The land would claim her, just as it had claimed the others before her, and the curse would continue forever. With a final, shuddering breath, she closed her eyes, and then everything went black. The land chooses. And so the woman becomes just another echo, another voice that will linger in the static, a part of the land that will never die. The cycle continues, and the land waits, patient, for the next Watcher, the next sacrifice. The Watcher is not just an entity, it is an eternal force, tied to the mountains, to the woods, to the very soul of the land itself. But what of the land's endless hunger? What of the next one to arrive? The night had swallowed everything whole. The cabin, once a safe haven from the biting cold and isolation of the Rockies, now stood as a hollow tomb in the deepening winter. Its walls, stained by the presence of something ancient and malevolent, seemed to hum with an energy that wasn't quite of this world. The land, hungry and waiting, had claimed another. But it wasn't just the woman who was taken. The Watcher had not been satisfied with her soul alone. It had fed on everything. She was her fear, her memories, her breath, and now her silence. But the cycle never truly ends. Out in the woods, deep beneath the dark canopy, The trees began to shift. The moonlight filtered weakly through the branches, but it barely touched the snow. Everything around it felt too cold, too far. There was no warmth, no light that could push away the oppressive darkness that settled over the land. This forest, these mountains, had always been more than just a backdrop to the rangers' lives. They were the foundation of something much more terrifying. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of a crunching boot against snow echoed, a new presence. The land had claimed another soul, another ranger. He had arrived. His name was Jesse, a young man fresh to the job, unaware of the horrors that had been woven into the very soil he had sworn to protect. His excitement at the prospect of a quiet night shift in one of the country's most beautiful parks had quickly turned to dread when he first checked into the station and found the woman's last transmission. He had read the logbook, but there was nothing in it that could have prepared him for what he was about to face. Jesse stood at the cabin door, staring into the black void of the night, his breath fogging in the cold air. He felt something, someone, watching him. The hairs on the back of his neck rose. His hand lingered near the door handle, as if some invisible force was tugging at him, pulling him into the silence that waited beyond. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing the station's darkened interior. The faintest slivers of moonlight managed to slip through the frost-covered windows, casting elongated, twisted shadows across the floor. Jesse hesitated. "Hello?" His voice cracked, swallowed by the vast emptiness. But there was no answer, no response. He stepped in, his boots heavy on the floorboards, the silence pressing in on him like a weight. His eyes scanned the room, the faint, lingering echoes of the woman's presence still hanging in the air. He moved slowly, carefully, as though something might leap out from the shadows, clawing for his soul. The radio, still on the table, was caked in frost, the static pulsing eerily in the otherwise dead room. Had she really heard something on the radio? Jesse's fingers brushed against the receiver. The faintest touch, but it was enough to send a ripple of cold up his spine. His breath caught. For a brief moment, he thought he heard a voice, a soft, strangled whisper coming from the radio's crackling speakers. "It's here." Jesse recoiled, his pulse racing. His heart beat faster, more erratically now, as he looked around the room again. There were no signs of struggle, no obvious traces of anything sinister. But the unease gnawed at him. Something wasn't right. He looked at the logbook on the counter. It was open to the last entry. Her entry. The woman's handwritten, words scribbled in a hurried hand. "If you hear it, don't answer. Don't look outside." The words were like a rope, pulling him deeper into the pit of terror. She had heard the same voice, the same cries. The watcher's hunger hadn't been sated by her sacrifice, but had instead been passed on like a plague to him. The air shifted. Jesse froze. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't just the cold, it was something else, something deeper, something that had been waiting. A sound, faint but unmistakable, echoed from outside, a soft, rhythmic knocking on the door. It was the same knock. Jesse's blood ran cold. His eyes darted to the door, his body rigid with fear. There was a sickening, heavy feeling in the pit of his stomach. The land had a pattern. The watcher's hunger followed a cycle, and it was closing in on him now. The knocking grew louder, faster, and with it, the static from the radio intensified, almost in time with the noise. It was a pulse, a rhythm that hummed through the ground beneath his feet. Jesse wanted to turn and run, to leave, to scream. But something held him there. The door creaked open on its own, as if guided by an unseen hand, and through the crack he saw it. The Watcher. It was closer now, standing just beyond the threshold, its form more solid than before. The twisted branches that made up its body groaned, snapping and shifting as it moved. The tendrils that made up its limbs reached forward. as though beckoning him to step out into the forest. The woman's warnings echoed in his mind. "It's here. Don't answer." But he couldn't move. His legs felt rooted to the ground. "Help me," the watcher's voice rasped, though it was not the voice of a man, but something far older, far darker. The sound was like the rumble of the earth, itself a low growl that vibrated through his bones. Jesse's breath caught in his throat. He had seen the logbook. He had read the warnings. He knew what this creature wanted. And yet still he felt a pull, something compelling him forward, out of the cabin, into the forest. The Watcher was not a creature that lived in the world of men. It was a force, a primal hunger that needed him. "Please," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The Watcher didn't speak, but it didn't need to. Its tendrils reached for him with a terrifying speed, wrapping around his legs, pulling him toward the door. The dark void of its face flickered in the shadows like an endless, shifting black hole. The door slammed shut behind him, and for the first time Jesse understood the curse. The land did not need individuals. It needed the Watcher, the one who could see, the one who could protect, the one who could be taken. The land had claimed him just as it had claimed the others. There was no escape, only the endless cycle of sacrifice, where the Watcher would continue forever and ever, the next Watcher. And so Jesse became part of the forest, his body, his soul, absorbed by the land that had never been truly dead. The Watcher was not just a beast. It was the land itself, an ancient entity that fed on the souls of those who dared to protect it. He would be forgotten in time, just as the others had been, his essence forever part of the unyielding earth beneath the park. But soon there would be another. The land would always demand more. Jesse's body, stiff and cold, lay in the center of the clearing, the frost beginning to form around his limbs. His eyes were wide open, staring into the black abyss above, but there was no awareness in them. His soul, his essence, had already been consumed, taken by the land, and now only his body remained, a vessel for the Watcher's endless hunger. The forest stood still around him, as if holding its breath. Somewhere in the distance, the howling wind carried the faintest whispers of a voice, soft, fleeting and haunting. It sounded familiar. No, it can't be. The woman's voice, her spirit, whispered through the pines, a reminder that she too was once the Watcher. She had become part of the land, her sacrifice having fed the forest just as Jesse's would. She was not dead. She was simply gone. But the land had always known what was needed. The trees stirred as if responding to some unseen command, their limbs creaking and groaning under the weight of ancient forces. The Watcher stood at the edge of the clearing, its monstrous shape twisting in the night, as if in an eternal dance with the darkness. Its branches scraped the sky, their twisted forms reaching out like claws, hungry, relentless. And yet, it was still. It waited. There was a pull, a gravitational force that Jesse could not resist, no matter how hard he fought against it. The land had claimed him as it had done with all those before him. But the question remained, why had the Watcher chosen him? What had it seen in him? Was he just another pawn in an eternal game of sacrifice? Or was there something deeper at play? The woman's voice called again, echoing through the cold night air. It chooses every time. Jesse closed his eyes, his heartbeat quickening. He had to escape. He had to fight. He had read the logbook. He had read the warnings. You can't escape it, Jesse. Don't look outside and don't answer. But the compulsion to step out into the darkness to face the Watcher was overwhelming. Why? The Watcher had no face. It had no eyes. And yet, somehow, Jesse knew that it could see him. It had always been watching. always waiting for the next one to come, and that's when it hit him. The Watcher had been waiting for him. The land had always been a place of shadows, a place of secrets. But Jesse now understood its true nature. This was not just a curse, it was a pact. An ancient deal forged in blood and soil between something far older than any human could comprehend. A force that had been born from the earth itself. The Watcher was not merely a monster, it was the land's will made manifest. And it wasn't looking for victims, it was looking for witnesses. The Watcher needed someone who could see the truth, someone who could recognize the unbroken cycle of sacrifice that had begun centuries ago. Someone who could understand that the land had been alive from the very first moment the Rangers set foot here. The forest had no intention of letting go. It was eternal. The land was always watching, always in need of someone to take the role of the Watcher. And so the Watcher chose. It had chosen Jesse, just as it had chosen the woman before him. They were all part of the land now. Each of them was a guardian, a keeper, a sacrifice. But more than that, they were the reflection of the land's hunger. Jesse had understood too late. He had been pulled in by the whispers, the static on the radio, the desperation of the woman's final words. But in his last moments, he knew the truth. The Watcher wasn't just a monster. The Watcher was the land. The land was both the predator and the prey. It had fed on the Rangers for centuries, but it could only continue so long as the Watchers were willing to serve. Every cycle had a price that grew with each passing year, until the land could not sustain itself without a new witness to its eternal hunger. Jesse stood now on the threshold between life and death, his spirit torn. He could feel it, the pull of the land dragging him down deeper into its heart. But still, the choice remained. Would he, like all the others, become one with the land? Or could he break the curse that had been placed upon this sacred ground? He turned his gaze toward the Watcher. Its branches trembled as if it, too, felt the weight of the decision. And then, with an agonizing wrench, Jesse understood the true nature of the sacrifice. A sharp, shrill cry tore through the air, cutting through the frozen silence of the night. A figure appeared from the shadows, the woman. Her form was ghostly, her presence barely a whisper in the cold wind. But there she stood, her eyes wide with a look of sorrow and determination. She had been the Watcher before him. She had been claimed by the land, her essence now interwoven with it. But still, she had a choice. In her final breath, she had understood what Jesse was now realizing. She had been both a witness and a victim, and now she would give him the same choice. Break the cycle, her voice whispered, filled with the weight of centuries. Or let it claim you too. Jesse's heart raced. There was no escape. The land always won. But as the Watcher's tendrils reached out for him, he made his decision. With every ounce of strength, he shouted into the air, "I refuse!" And in that moment, the Watcher paused. The forest held its breath. A surge of power, old and primal, rippled through the ground beneath him, shaking the earth itself. The trees twisted and groaned, their bark splitting open like the skin of some ancient, monstrous creature. The Watcher's limbs curled inward, writhing with the fury of ages past. The Watcher's choice. Jesse stood, heart pounding, as the Watcher loomed before him. The land had chosen him. But could he choose something else? Could he break the endless cycle? The trees around him began to warp, their forms shifting between human and animal, twisting into monstrous shapes. The Watcher was not a creature of flesh. It was a creature of will. And Jesse had made his choice. But the land had its own too. The air grew heavier with every breath Jesse took. It was as though the forest was exhaling, its very lungs filled with a suffocating darkness that threatened to choke him. The trees groaned, and the ground beneath his feet trembled, as though the land itself were alive, aware of his defiance, of the choice he had made. The Watcher loomed before him, its form twisting and shifting, and in that shifting, it revealed something Jesse had not yet seen. The Watcher was not a single creature. It was a collective, a host of countless souls woven into the fabric of the land. The twisted, grotesque limbs, the crackling branches, the hollow, faceless figure. It was only the body. The true essence of the Watcher was the voices of those who had fallen before. They whispered in unison. "You cannot escape what is already written," they chanted. Their voices a chorus of pain and regret, each syllable a prayer for release that had never come. The land is eternal. It will always demand, always claim. Jesse's heart pounded in his chest, each beat like a drum of war. He could feel it, the pull, that magnetic force trying to drag him into the ground. The Watcher was its will, its reflection. The entity fed on the witnesses, the ones who had come to the land, trying to protect it, only to become part of it. His fingers clenched into fists, his breath quick and shallow. He had read the logbook. He had seen the woman's last entry. She had tried to warn him, but there was more. There was always more. This wasn't just about survival. It was about acceptance. For a moment, Jesse felt the despair flood him, overwhelming, threatening to pull him under. Was it really possible to break this cycle? Could any of them escape? Could he escape? The Watcher's tendrils reached out, writhing through the air, pulsing with energy. He could feel their icy grip wrapping around his legs, pulling him forward, inch by inch, closer to its ravenous embrace. But then something shifted. A whisper, faint but clear, pierced the air. Fight. It was her. The woman, the one who had been the Watcher before him. She was here, in the air, in the very forest itself. Her spirit had never truly left. She had been trapped here, just as the Watcher had been, but she had never stopped fighting. Now, her presence had returned to guide him, to show him the truth. Jesse's hands trembled as he reached for the earth. He could feel the cold soil, the ancient pulse of the land beneath him. For the first time since his arrival, he realized the land was not just a place, it was a prison that fed on the souls of those who dared to venture into it, to protect it. And yet somehow, in the silence of that night, Jesse understood something deeper. The land could be freed. In one final, desperate push, Jesse thrust his hands into the ground, his fingers digging deep into the soil. The Watcher screamed, a guttural, primal sound that shook the trees. The branches of the forest trembled violently, the very air around him crackling with energy. The whispers, the voices, grew louder. They were no longer pleas for release. They were angry. The spirits trapped in the Watcher's form screamed, cursed, and raged at him. "Let us go," they cried in unison. "End the curse." With everything he had, Jesse clenched his eyes shut and pushed deeper into the earth, summoning the strength from the land itself. It was his last chance. He could feel the Watcher's power, the force of the forest's hunger, trying to pull him in, trying to twist his soul into its endless cycle. But Jesse would not let it. He shouted into the night, his voice hoarse, raw, with emotion. "I will break you." The ground beneath him shuddered. The trees twisted, their roots tearing through the earth as if in agony. The Watcher howled in fury, but Jesse's resolve did not falter. In that moment, something miraculous happened. The earth answered. The trees began to bend away from him. The Watcher's form flickered, as though something was tearing it apart from within. The branches crumbled, the limbs snapping, the bark splintering as if it were made of brittle wood. The land itself recoiled, releasing the grip it had held for centuries, and in the midst of it all, The woman's voice echoed one. "Final time clear and full of purpose. You have set us free." Jesse fell back onto the ground, gasping for breath, the weight of the land's oppression lifting from his chest. The night air was still, the oppressive darkness that had hung over the forest now gone. The howling wind was no longer a mournful cry. There was peace, real peace, for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The Watcher was gone. The land was no longer hungry, but it had come at a price. Jesse's body felt drained, as though the land had taken its own toll. The woods, though silent now, seemed to whisper something else, a promise, a warning, a future that could still remain uncertain. In the distance, beyond the trees, Jesse could see the first rays of dawn beginning to break through the horizon, casting a pale golden light over the snow-covered forest. He had won, but the land, even in its newfound stillness, still had its secrets, and in the distance, the faintest sound of footsteps on snow reached his ears. The next Watcher was already coming. Cliffhanger, the Watcher's return. Jesse turned to look toward the horizon, his breath quickening. He had freed the land, but in doing so, he knew the cycle had only been interrupted, not ended. The land would always call out for a Watcher, and one day, another would answer. The question wasn't whether it would come, it was who would be next. Final reflection, and so ends the tale of the Watcher. But the land's hunger has not been quelled forever. The echoes of this ancient pact still linger in the hearts of those who step into its grasp. For the land of the Rockies is both a prison and a home, a place that feeds on the souls of those brave enough or desperate enough to defend it. The Watcher may be gone, but the cycle is endless. Perhaps it's always been that way. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The mountains of Colorado whispered in the dead of night, the air sharp with the scent of pine, earth, and something else. Something cold that gnawed at the bones. The long, winding road into the heart of the Rocky Mountain National Park seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the wilderness itself was trying to pull Michael in deeper, away from the rest of the world. It had taken hours to get here, and now, on the final stretch, a thick fog rolled in, clinging to his headlights in shifting tendrils like pale fingers trying to steer him off course. Michael's fingers tightened around the steering wheel of the park-issued Jeep, his heart hammering in his chest. He hadn't meant to take this shift, but here he was, a rookie ranger, alone in one of the most isolated and eerie sections of the park. The kind of place where stories of disappearances and strange occurrences were more than just rumors. He'd heard the tales, but chalked them up to drunken exaggerations around a campfire. Until now. As he rounded a bend, the small ranger station came into view. Its silhouette, bathed in the dim light of the moon, seemed to sag under the weight of the mountains themselves, as if it had been standing there for centuries, forgotten and forsaken. The flickering light above the porch was the only sign of life. It cast long, trembling shadows, and for a moment, Michael swore he saw something shift within those shadows. But when he blinked, nothing was there. He parked the Jeep in front of the station, the gravel crunching under the tires. The fog thickened, rolling around his boots like smoke. He stepped out into the night, feeling the chill in the air crawl beneath his jacket. His breath, heavy and visible in the cold, became a cloud of fog that quickly dissipated into the still night. He had heard about the remoteness of this particular station, how the previous ranger had gone missing without a trace a few months ago. They'd sent someone else, but it was a year before a new ranger arrived for the night shift. And now, It was Michael's turn. The door creaked open as he approached, the metal latch groaning in protest, as if the station itself was reluctant to let him in. The interior was dimly lit, with a flickering bulb overhead that buzzed in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. The smell of old wood, dust and stale coffee lingered in the air. It felt abandoned, like it had been forgotten for too long. Michael couldn't shake the sense that the walls were closing in around him, the isolation pressing against him like an unseen weight. There were no windows to the outside, just one heavy door that seemed to lead into nothing but the suffocating wilderness. He exhaled slowly, trying to center himself. This is just a job, he reminded himself. He could do this. It was only for one night. Just one night. He moved past the cluttered desk, where a single radio sat in the corner, its antenna cracked and bent at a strange angle. The radio crackled once, a strange, unsettling noise that made Michael pause for a moment, his hand still hovering over the station logbook. You're just hearing things, he thought. But the feeling of something unseen lingering in the corners of the room didn't fade. The logbook had been left open to a page that seemed to almost glow in the dim light. The last entry was dated 5 years ago, scribbled in hurried handwriting, the words barely legible. If you hear it, don't answer. Don't look outside. His stomach twisted. He had heard about the disappearances, the unexplained radio calls that had been made over the years. A part of him wanted to dismiss it as some kind of old superstition, but another, quieter part of him whispered that it was too much of a coincidence. He reached for the radio, almost as if it were pulling him toward it. His fingers brushed against the cold metal, and he hesitated. No, I'm here to do my job. He tried to shake the feeling off, but it was hard to ignore the way the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. With a steadying breath, Michael turned on the radio. It crackled, then went silent. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat, the faintest thrum in his ears. Then, static. A voice, faint at first, barely audible beneath the crackle of interference. But the words, when they came, sent a cold shiver crawling down his spine. I need backup. It's watching me. I can't move. The words were barely a whisper, distorted by the static. But the fear in the voice was undeniable. Michael's eyes widened, his pulse quickening. Hello? He said into the microphone, his voice shaky. This is Ranger Michael. Is anyone there? The static broke again, but the voice didn't return, only the hum of the radio, just static. But then it came again, louder this time, and more desperate. I can't move, please help me. It's watching me. Michael's chest tightened. His first instinct was to jump into action, to grab the radio and call for backup. But the eerie emptiness of the station, the oppressive silence that seemed to deepen with every passing second, held him back. No one else is here, he reminded himself. You're alone. They can't help you. He snapped the radio off. His breath was coming too fast, too shallow. His mind raced through every explanation. He could think of pranks, faulty equipment, interference, but none of them seemed to fit. The voice on the radio had been too real, too full of panic. He grabbed the logbook again, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. The radio call, the one he had just heard, wasn't the first. The same call had been recorded 5 years ago on this exact night. The same words, I can't move, it's watching me. Michael's breath hitched, his eyes widening as he read the logbook entry that followed. If you hear it, don't answer, don't look outside. The words burned into his mind, and as he read them, a low thump echoed from somewhere outside. He froze. Was that the wind? No, the thump came again. It was closer this time. A cold, creeping sense of dread washed over him as he stood rooted to the spot. He could hear something out there just beyond the walls. The unmistakable sound of slow, deliberate footsteps crunching in the gravel just outside the station. Who is that? He moved toward the window, his legs unsteady, every part of him screaming to run. He peeked through the blinds, but there was nothing, just the dark. The inky, impenetrable black of the night outside. Another thump, closer now. The footsteps seemed to be circling the station. A shadow shifted in the corner of his eye, and then the radio crackled again. It's too close. It sees me. Please help me. The voice sounded even more desperate now, broken. Michael's fingers fumbled for the radio again, but before he could press the button, a loud bang rattled the door. The station's light flickered once, then twice. And in the silence that followed, Michael felt it. A cold, heavy weight pressing on his chest, as if the darkness had suddenly become alive. What does the voice mean by "it's watching me"? Who, what, was outside? The radio had fallen silent again. The voice, the same terrified plea for help, had vanished as abruptly as it had come. Michael's hand still hovered over the microphone, his breath shallow, his mind racing. For a moment, he considered calling it all off, leaving the station, driving back down the mountain to safety. But the mountains stretched out in all directions, a labyrinth of jagged peaks and thick, impenetrable forest. The park was too vast. There was nowhere to go. He was trapped here, and yet that nagging feeling in his chest, that unease, didn't leave. The air around him felt thick, pressing, as if the very walls of the station were closing in. Outside, the silence seemed to settle deeper, suffocating the usual sounds of wildlife and rustling leaves. No animals, no wind, not even a cricket's chirp. Michael's feet moved almost of their own accord, carrying him away from the desk, away from the radio, deeper into the station's dim interior. The walls felt too close, the flickering light above his head casting long shadows that seemed to move just out of the corner of his eye. His senses were on high alert. Every creak, every groan of the station, every shifting shadow felt like a warning, like something was waiting just out of reach. He checked the windows, but they were, as he remembered, grimy and fogged up. Outside, the trees swayed in the stillness, their skeletal branches stretching toward him like dark fingers. It was too quiet, too still, not even a whisper of the wind. Michael shook his head. Get it together. He was just being paranoid. The isolation was starting to mess with him. He had to stay focused. Grabbing his jacket, he went to the back room to prepare for his shift, checking the equipment, gathering supplies, and trying to push the thought of the radio call out of his mind. There had to be a logical explanation. But no matter how hard he tried to focus, that sinking feeling kept clawing at the edges of his thoughts. The silence was maddening. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from outside the door. His heart skipped. A beat. His breath caught in his throat. He jerked his head toward the sound. It had come from the porch. At first, Michael stood frozen, unsure if he had imagined it. He slowly approached the door, one hand gripping the cold brass knob. The other hand was shaking so violently he almost dropped the flashlight he had grabbed from the shelf. The beam of light from the flashlight trembled in his grip, casting more eerie shadows across the walls. It was as if the house itself were holding its breath. The door was still locked, the heavy silence outside uninterrupted. Michael's instinct screamed at him to stay away, but the human need for answers, the need to know what was out there, drove him forward. He opened the door a crack, just enough to peer through, the cold air from outside rushing in like a flood of ice water. The beam of light swept over the porch, illuminating only a patch of the gravel path, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no movement, just the oppressive stillness. Still, the feeling of eyes on him did not go away. He closed the door quickly, bolting it shut once more, his pulse hammering in his ears. The whole station felt suffocating now, as if the very air had thickened into something dense and unyielding, something that pressed against his lungs with every breath. It's just the wind, he tried to convince himself, but the doubt still gnawed at him. He turned back to the desk and the radio, hoping for some kind of rational explanation. He couldn't help himself. He had to try again. The voice, that desperate cry for help, was still fresh in his mind. Reaching for the radio once more, he flicked it on. This time, there was no static, no crackling sound, just silence. For what seemed like an eternity, nothing happened. His breath came in short bursts as he held the microphone to his lips. "This is Ranger Michael again. Can anyone hear me?" The radio hummed to life. The static buzzed and crackled once more. And then, like a dark memory creeping back to life, the voice returned. Faint, distant, but undeniably there. "It's too close." Michael's stomach twisted in knots. The words were coming through louder now, though still broken, still distorted by the static. But the fear, the panic in the voice was unmistakable. The voice continued. "It's watching me. It sees me. Please, help me." A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. The words felt too real, too desperate. It wasn't just some glitch. This wasn't a prank. Someone, or something, was out there. Suddenly, the door rattled. Michael whipped around, his pulse spiking. The noise came again, louder this time. A harsh rattle, like someone, or something, was shaking the very foundation of the building. His breath caught in his throat. His instinct screamed at him to leave, to run, but his feet were rooted to the floor, the window. His eyes darted to the small pane in the far corner of the room. He had to look. Against all of his better judgment, he moved toward the window, his legs trembling beneath him. The shadows outside seemed to stretch and distort, swirling in the pale light of the flickering bulb above. He could see nothing at first, just the blackness of the night, the silhouettes of the trees bending unnaturally as if they too had been caught in the grip of some unseen force. Then he saw it, a figure at the edge of the tree line, barely visible against the dark backdrop of the forest, stood something. At first it looked like a man, tall, maybe 6 feet or more, draped in tattered clothing. But the way it stood, frozen, unmoving, watching, sent a jolt of ice through Michael's veins. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. Its shape was almost featureless in the dim light, and yet Michael felt its eyes on him. Even from a distance, he could feel its gaze piercing through the glass, cold and unblinking. The air around him seemed to shift, thickening with a new, palpable weight. Michael's chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow gasps. It's not human. He could feel it. Before he could take another breath, the figure stepped forward. The world outside seemed to ripple, the shadow shifting unnaturally, stretching like a fluid thing. It wasn't just the movement that unnerved him. It was the way the trees around it seemed to bend back in response, like they were pulling away from something unseen. Michael's heart skipped a beat as the figure took another step. His hand shot out to the radio once more. But as he grabbed it, something, the unmistakable sound of breathing, echoed through the room. Deep, labored, close, too close. Did it see him? Was this what was out there? The thing on the radio? Michael was no longer certain what was real. The air had become a thick fog of dread, blurring the line between the outside world and the twisted thing standing just beyond the window. The figure moved again, closer now, its form elongating unnaturally, its shadow stretching across the ground like a living thing. And somewhere in the distance, the voice on the radio whispered again, its words fragmented but chillingly clear. "It's too close. It sees me. Please, help me." What was watching him? What was out there? The terror clawed at his chest. And Michael understood now. This was no ordinary night shift. The park was alive with something more ancient, something more dangerous. And the silence that had once been comforting was now a suffocating omen. The cold sweat on Michael's forehead turned into a clammy chill that crawled down his spine. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, but it wasn't just fear. There was something deeper, more primal, the sensation of being watched, of being known by something that shouldn't know him at all. The air inside the station was dense, suffocating, and every tiny creak or rustle outside the window made his nerves stand on end. He dared not move too quickly, afraid that any motion, any sudden action, would provoke whatever was out there. The figure outside had moved, but not in any way a human should have. Its form had stretched, elongating, its limbs far too long. Shadows clung to it like living things, its outline bending in ways that defied natural laws. It was as though it was melting, its features becoming a distorted silhouette that neither resembled man nor beast. Michael took a step backward, then another, heart racing as he tried to distance himself from the window. But his feet felt like lead, unwilling to obey him. Suddenly the lights above flickered, once, twice, then dimmed to near darkness. The only illumination now came from the beam of his flashlight, still shaking in his trembling hand. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and mildew, but there was something else. A rancid metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. He quickly turned the radio's volume up, hoping for some kind of communication, some kind of answer. But the static returned in waves, grating on his nerves. A voice, a faint voice lost beneath layers of noise, began to bleed through. It watches from the shadows. I couldn't run. I couldn't escape. Michael's breath caught in his throat. That voice. It was the same one, the one he had heard earlier. It was closer now. Please, don't look at it. Don't let it see you. His legs nearly buckled. The voice had been begging. Michael's hand shot out to steady himself against the edge of the desk, his knuckles white from the force of his grip. The voice seemed to dissipate into static again, and then only the hum of electricity filled the room. But it wasn't the hum of the lights. No, this was something darker. Michael stood still, forcing himself to breathe in measured, shallow breaths. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, like a heavy blanket pressing down on his chest. He needed to move. He needed to act, but his mind refused to cooperate. What was he supposed to do? There was no help, no backup. He was utterly alone. Then it came again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps scraping against gravel. The slow, deliberate pace. Outside. He knew it was outside. There was no mistaking that sound. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. It was footsteps, slow and heavy, as if something or someone was circling the station. The pressure on his chest grew, as if invisible hands were squeezing the very life out of him. The terror was mounting now. This wasn't just a call for backup anymore. This wasn't just an eerie encounter. Something malevolent was in those woods, and it was drawing closer. A voice, a whisper, low and terrible, slithered through the crack under the door. Michael's head snapped toward the source, his pulse spiking. I see you. His breath caught. That voice. It was close. Too close. It felt as though it was right outside the door, but no. He couldn't move. His body was frozen, his mind spinning wildly. Was he hearing things? The door rumbled under a heavy thud, then another, and another. It was trying to get in. Michael backed up slowly, his feet scraping against the wooden floorboards, a nervous twitch in his movements. His mind screamed at him to do something, anything. But all he could hear was the pounding in, his head growing louder with each passing second. Then the static-filled radio burst back to life, louder now. Michael. His name. His own name whispered through the crackling, distorted noise. "Michael, do you see me?" Michael's pulse nearly stopped. He couldn't breathe. He stared at the radio as if it were a sentient thing, alive, watching him. Voice continued, thick with distortion. "We're so much alike." A deep shiver racked Michael's body. He had to get away from it. Had to get away from the radio, from the shadows that seemed to creep through the walls. But where could he go? He was trapped. The air in the room had become unbearable, stuffed with the thick smell of decay. There was a rotting quality to the air now. It wasn't just the silence. It was the way the atmosphere felt, contaminated. And that's when he heard it. The voice more distinct now, clearer than ever before. "I'm still here." His heart lurched. He turned, eyes frantic, seeking the source of the voice. But nothing in the room had changed. The shadows were the same. The dim light above flickered sporadically, casting long, distorted figures along the walls. But something was off. The shadows. They seemed to stretch just a little further, closer to him. His throat constricted and panic surged through his veins. Michael stumbled back, knocking over a stack of papers. They scattered across the floor like forgotten memories. The papers, blank, yellowed, slipped into the cracks between the floorboards. But something caught his eye. A name, no, a phrase, was scrawled across one of the papers, written in jagged letters. "I see you." Michael gasped, taking a few unsteady steps backward. Had that always been there? His breath caught again. The shadows, those long stretching shadows, seemed to slither toward him, like tendrils of some dark, living thing. That was it. The air was no longer just suffocating. It was alive. The realization hit him then. The voice on the radio, the footsteps outside, the shadows creeping across the room. It wasn't just one thing. There was something in the shadows. Something that had been there long before him. Something that had always watched, always waited. And now it was waking up. His heart was pounding in his chest. His legs were shaking. He had to get out of there, had to get away from this cursed station, but the door, it wouldn't open. The door rattled again. It had locked itself. What was it that was watching him? Was it inside now? The shadows were coming alive. They were stretching across the walls, reaching for him. The entity, once nothing more than a shadow itself, was now beginning to form, slowly but unmistakably. Michael's mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. He didn't know what was happening, didn't know who to trust or what to believe anymore. The supernatural forces were drawing closer, their presence more palpable than ever. The station felt like it was closing in on him, as though the building itself were becoming part of the malevolent force. The question that echoed in his mind was simple. Could he survive the night? But the answer, like everything else, was uncertain. All he could do was face the growing terror, knowing that the shadows, the voice, the figure outside, and the entity had already claimed this place. And Michael was next. The door rattled again. Michael froze, his chest tight, his breath shallow. It was relentless now. The banging, thudding, scratching against the door had intensified. He could hear it so clearly, like nails on wood, like teeth on bone, grating. With every second, it was inside, or at least it was trying to be. Trying to break through. The flashlight in Michael's trembling hand flickered, casting erratic beams of light that barely pierced the growing shadows in the corners of the room. The oppressive weight of the air pressed on him, suffocating, as if the station itself were becoming an extension of the darkness that surrounded it. He stepped back instinctively, but his legs didn't move fast enough. His body was betraying him, paralyzed with fear. The shadows were closer now. They didn't just linger at the edges of the room. They shifted in unnatural ways, swirling in the corners, bending toward him like hands eager to grasp him, to pull him into the dark. For a moment, everything was still. The banging stopped, the shadows paused. But then it came again, a slow, creeping, scratching sound from the walls. At first it was faint, just a whisper behind the drywall. Then it grew louder, scratching in a rhythmic pattern, as though someone was digging, clawing, trying to break free from the other side. Michael's mind spun. He knew what was happening, but he couldn't make sense of it. He was trapped in a room with the thing that had been watching him since the moment he stepped foot in the station. The walls seemed to breathe around him. The floorboards groaned, shifting beneath his weight. The station felt alive in a way that it never had before. The walls weren't just walls anymore. They were an extension of the malevolent presence that surrounded him. And then it came, an image, unbidden, rushing into his mind. The logbook. Michael's head snapped toward the desk where he had seen it earlier, the logbook that had detailed the previous ranger's final days, the one that had warned him. A chill ran down his spine as he remembered the last entry. If you hear it, don't answer. Don't look outside. He had ignored the warning then, convinced it was just another piece of paranoia from a man who had lost his mind. But now, as the scratching in the walls grew louder, it felt like that last entry wasn't just a warning, it was a prophecy. Michael stumbled toward the desk, his breath coming in jagged gasps. He grabbed the logbook with shaking hands, flipping through the yellowed pages, each one filled with the same frantic scribbles, the same desperate pleas. The entries, all of them, seemed to mirror his own descent into madness. The scratching in the walls, the feeling of being watched, the never-ending silence that suffocates you from within. One entry from weeks before the last ranger's final note caught his attention. It was written in larger, more frantic letters. It knows. It's been watching me from the inside. I've seen it in the walls. I can hear it breathing. Michael's heart thundered in his chest. It was in the walls. His mind reeled, trying to process this. The creature, the thing that had been whispering to him through the radio, wasn't just outside anymore. It had already found a way inside the station. It had always been inside. The scratching, the sounds. The thing was already part of the station itself. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from the walls. The sound reverberated, as though something heavy had just broken free from the wood and plaster. Michael turned toward the sound, eyes wide in horror. The walls. They were moving. The scratching continued, but now it was joined by something else. Thumping, a heavy, rhythmic thud, as if something was pounding, thrashing behind the wall. A series of muffled noises followed, like something trying to force its way through the plaster. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. What the hell was happening? The radio hummed to life again. Its static screeched through the room, filling the air with an eerie, unnatural crackling. And then the voice came. Michael, you shouldn't have listened. It was a whisper, deep and guttural, but distinct. Michael staggered back, clutching his head as the voice swirled around him. It wasn't just a voice from the radio now. It was everywhere. It surrounded him, pressing in from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. You see me now. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow longer, stretching toward him with a slow, deliberate crawl. Michael's pulse thundered in his ears as he backed away from the radio, but there was nowhere left to run. It was closing in. His eyes darted wildly from one corner to the other, unable to focus on any one thing for long. Every corner seemed to bend, twist, and warp, as though reality itself was crumbling around him. What was it? What was this thing? We are the same. The words felt like a cold hand on his chest, like a pressure so deep he could feel it inside his very soul. The shadows, those shapes in the corners of the room, moved again, slowly, gently, but they weren't shadows anymore. No, these were figures, tall and elongated, just like the thing Michael had seen outside the window earlier. Their forms flickered and bent unnaturally, stretching like oil spilled across glass. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the dark, suffocating air. The figures were closing in, and their eyes, empty, black eyes, were focused on him. They were watching him. "I've been waiting." The voice seemed to echo from the walls themselves, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The walls. The walls were breathing now, expanding and contracting with the force of something alive, as though the house itself were becoming part of the entity, part of the growing darkness. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the walls, and in that moment, Michael understood. The entity wasn't just a thing outside, it had been with him all along. It had been inside the station, in the walls, in the very structure of the place, just waiting for him to come, waiting for the right moment to show itself, waiting for him to let it in, and now it was ready. The walls began to crack. Something was emerging from within. What would emerge from the walls? Was this the end of the station, or had it just begun? Michael's mind was teetering on the edge of reality. The entity was no longer just a presence. It was a force that had invaded his very surroundings. And now it was waiting for him to make his final move. Would he fight? Would he flee? Or would he be consumed by the very walls that had been the backdrop of his growing horror? The walls were breaking apart, and Michael realized too late that the creature hadn't just been waiting. It had been growing, feeding on the silence, on the fear. And now that it had him, it wouldn't stop until it had completely absorbed him into its dark, endless void. The walls groaned like they were alive. The cracks spread slowly at first, as though the station was breathing, but then, with a sickening snap, the walls split open. The thick, dry wood cracked apart as something immense pushed from within, something with far too many limbs, far too many eyes. The shadows that once clung to the corners of the room began to twist and coil, writhing like black serpents, snaking toward Michael with an unnatural urgency. It was a creature, but not one that could be called anything so simple. The walls peeled, open, revealing its form like something out of a nightmare made flesh, an amalgamation of elongated limbs and broken features twisting in unnatural patterns. Its skin, or what could pass for skin, was a dark, mottled mass, slick and shiny, glistening in the dim flashlight's beam. And in the center of it all, its eyes. Hundreds of eyes blinked open across its mass, all black, all endless voids, unblinking, unfeeling. They stared at him, at Michael, and he felt something twist in his gut. Not just fear, not just panic, but something deeper, a hunger. It was as if this thing was feeding on his very essence, his thoughts, his identity. It didn't speak, not with words anyway. It spoke with presence. The air around Michael became thick, as if the very atmosphere had been sucked from the room. The walls stretched, groaned, and the thing, the entity, pulsed, its mass undulating as though it was breathing. Michael's mind reeled as he took a staggering step back. He could feel its weight pressing on him, pushing him toward the ground, suffocating him with a presence that was too large, too vast to comprehend. But there was no escaping it now. The station, this place, was no longer just a structure. It was part of the thing. Its walls, its floors, its very beams and windows had become flesh, stretching and twisting, becoming alive with the entity's power. It was drawing him closer. He could feel it now, the pull, the magnetic force that called to him from the very walls, the very floor beneath his feet. His body felt heavy, his limbs sluggish, as though the creature's essence was seeping into him, trying to take root in his mind. He reached for the radio, but his fingers were numb. The static blared into the room, a cacophony of sound. But there was something different now. There were voices, hundreds of them, layered on top of one another, indistinct but intimate. "I see you." The words weren't coming from the radio anymore. They were coming from inside him, from his very thoughts. He could hear them in his head, in the back of his skull, slithering like snakes. He tried to shout, tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come. The shadows were no longer just crawling. They were wrapping around him, pulling him toward the entity. He could feel their cold, slithering touch against his skin, like icy fingers dragging him down into an abyss. And the eyes, all those eyes, hundreds of them, staring, watching, waiting. They were in the walls, in the ceiling, in his head. They followed his every movement. One eye, larger than the others, blinked slowly, its black, endless gaze fixed on Michael. And with that blink, it was as if the room twisted, the very space around him warping. He saw the past, felt it, every other ranger who had been here before him, every soul who had walked this cursed ground, who had answered the call only to be swallowed by it. They were all trapped here, not in body but in soul, their forms twisted, distorted like marionettes, bound to the entity. "Help me," the voice came, distant but familiar. It was one of the rangers, one of the lost souls, trapped in the walls. His body, or what was left of it, flickered in the shadow, its eyes wide with terror. "It's too late for you." The voice cracked. The image flickered again. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, but his body couldn't move. His arms and legs were locked in place, a strange numbness creeping over him. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't. The shadowy tendrils were everywhere now, wrapping around his wrists, his ankles, pulling him toward the wall. It was trying to consume him, not just in body, but in soul. He remembered the logbook again, the warnings, the same warnings that had been written by others, by those who had come before him. But it was too late. He had already answered the call. He was already marked. A whisper tickled the edge of his mind, soft and insistent. "You're just like us now." The voice wasn't from the radio anymore. It was in his head. The others, the rangers, they were here, part of the walls, part of the shadows. They had all been absorbed into the entity. And Michael was being drawn in, his identity slipping away with each passing moment. It was devouring him, not just his body, but his sense of self, his existence. He could feel it. The hunger, and the worst part, it felt familiar. The cold, dark weight. It felt like he was being swallowed by the very thing he had been running from his entire life. This place, this station, had been his refuge, his escape, a place to hide from the pain of the past. But now, it was a tomb, and he was the final burial. The wall in front of him cracked open further, like a great mouth opening to swallow him whole. He could see the thing inside now, its true form, no longer hidden by the shadows. Its shape was grotesque, formless. It was neither animal nor human. It was a breeding ground for the hungry darkness. Its eyes, countless eyes, were watching, waiting. Then the tendrils stretched toward him, curling around his legs, pulling him closer to the wall. His breath was trapped in his chest as the shadows closed in, suffocating him, drawing him deeper into the blackness. He couldn't feel his limbs anymore, couldn't move. Everything was fading, but he couldn't die. Not like this. He had to fight. The walls were closing in, but Michael's mind was still his. Wasn't it? What happens when the entity consumes you completely? Can you ever escape once the darkness begins to swallow you whole? The room was closing in around him. The shadows were growing. Michael was running out of time, and the walls had already claimed his past. Would he lose his future to the hunger of the thing in the walls? The darkness consumed him, The walls, the station itself, closed in like a vice, squeezing out the very breath from his lungs. He was suffocating, drowning in the blackness that had swallowed all light, all sound. His body, once his own, was no longer his. It was held in place by the entity, bound by invisible chains of shadow and void. He could feel it inside him now, slithering through his veins like ice, spreading through his blood like poison. The entity was taking him, not just his flesh, but his essence, his memories. His very sense of self was slipping away, unraveling like thread from a needle, falling into the endless dark. His mind flashed to the logbook again, its pages filled with the fading words of those who had come before him. Rangers, all swallowed whole, their names forgotten, their voices lost in the oppressive silence of the station. Their souls had become part of the thing, trapped in the walls, the shadows. He could feel them now, their presence, seeping into his thoughts, mingling with his own. Their voices, their faces, their horrors, all blending into his own. Help me. It's too late. It was the voice from earlier, the ranger whose face had flickered in the shadows. He had been here too, had tried to warn Michael, but now he was part of the thing. A lost echo in the vast, empty dark. Michael's fingers twitched, his arms moving slowly, fighting against the pull of the thing, but it was so strong, so suffocating. The hunger, it consumed everything. He was being drawn toward it, his consciousness slipping into its vast maw. There was no escape. He thought of the radio. He thought of the last transmission, the distress call. But now it didn't seem like a warning anymore. It was a promise. The entity was patient. It had waited for years, for decades, for someone to answer its call. And now it had him. Now it would take everything from him. Do you hear it? The voice whispered, as though it were coming from everywhere and nowhere, sinking into his skull like a knife. It's in your veins now. You belong to it. You've always belonged to it. A flash of light. Just a spark. His hand shook as he reached for the radio once again, his fingers trembling with the last threads of his will. I need backup. He whispered hoarsely, echoing the voice from the past. The radio crackled in response. You are not alone, the voice hissed. We are always here. The words weren't comforting. They weren't a message of hope. They were a reminder that he was never truly alone, that the thing had been with him all along, in the station, in the shadows, in the silence. It had always been here, watching, waiting, calling to him. Suddenly everything went still. The walls, the air, the shadows, they stopped moving, stopped breathing. For a single terrifying moment, everything was silent. Then the walls cracked open wider. Out of the darkness, something crawled toward him. A shape, a form, a human form, or something. Like it, deformed, twisted, barely recognizable. But it was human once. It was the ranger from years ago. His face was gone. His skin was pale and slick, as though it had been stretched thin over something inhuman. His eyes, those dark, empty pits, were fixed on Michael, devoid of recognition. You shouldn't have listened. The voice was ragged, distorted, as though it had come from the depths of an abyss. You should have turned away. Now you're mine. We're all mine now. Michael recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. He had seen the images in the logbook, the twisted forms of those who had come before, their faces twisted with terror. But this was real. This was no longer a memory. It was here, in front of him, its eyes boring into his soul. It was the final truth. The entity wasn't just in the walls. It was in them. It was in everyone who had ever stayed here. It was a part of the place. The station was not just a structure. It was a prison, a feeding ground. And Michael had been drawn in like all the others. The shadowed tendrils slithered closer, crawling along the floor, the walls, reaching for his body, his mind. They wanted to consume him. His memories, his sense of self, his very soul. It would be devoured and twisted into the thing's hunger. But then, something inside him snapped. For just a moment, Michael felt a flash of clarity, a moment of resistance. He wasn't ready to give in, not completely. He could still feel the spark of his will, the tiny ember of defiance. With every ounce of strength left in him, Michael clenched his fists and forced his thoughts away from the entity, away from the pull of the darkness. He thought of everything he had left. He thought of his life outside, of the air, of the sunlight. He thought of the freedom he had lost and the freedom he had yet to regain. He fought. A guttural roar filled the room as the shadows recoiled, the darkness pulling back, as if the entity itself had been wounded or was at least weakened by his resistance. But it wasn't enough. The darkness writhed, pushing against his mind, against his soul, pulling him back toward it. It wanted him, all of him. It was too strong. And then, in that last desperate moment, Michael knew the only way to truly escape the station, to escape the thing that had been consuming him, was to sacrifice himself completely, to let go of his identity, his memories, everything. To surrender to the darkness. He reached out for the radio one final time. He whispered into the static, "Help me, please." The radio crackled, distorted voices rising and falling in a frenzy. Then, through the noise, a single word emerged. "You're not alone," and the darkness welcomed him. Time passed. Days, weeks, perhaps longer. The station had returned to its unnatural silence, though something had changed. The air was heavier now, thick with the scent of decay and mildew, the oppressive stillness clinging to every corner. It felt as though the very earth had absorbed the station's presence, sinking into the shadows beneath the towering pines of the Rockies. The radio was silent, but Michael's voice still lingered in the static. His last desperate plea, lost in the wilderness of the dead air. It had been a week since the storm, but no one had come to check on the station. No one ever came anymore. The storm had done its job, breaking the radio's connection to the outside world. The rangers at the nearby station, the ones who might have sent help, had likely assumed that the storm had claimed the lone ranger on duty. Poor Michael, just another victim of nature. It wasn't uncommon. Rangers came and went, some never returning from their lonely shifts. But there was something different this time. The storm had passed, the skies had cleared, and yet no one came. And no one would. The entity that had once clung to the walls, to the very air of the station, had not loosened its hold. It was still there, still waiting. And in the heart of the mountains, a new voice had begun to whisper in the dead air. The calling. It was the second shift, the quietest shift, that brought the new ranger to the station. A young man named Derek, fresh from the academy, nervous about his first assignment on his own. He had no idea what he was walking into, no inkling that he was about to become part of something far older and darker than he could have ever imagined. The ranger station was an isolated place. He had heard the rumors, of course, stories from the other rangers about the strange things that had happened there, the disappearances, the unexplained events. But Derek was no believer in ghost stories. He thought they were just that, stories. But by the time he arrived, the station was already waiting for him. As he stepped out of his truck, the mountain air felt strangely still. The usual rustle of the trees was absent. No chirping of birds, no hum of insects, just silence. The kind of silence that felt wrong. The wind didn't move. Derek shrugged it off, shaking his head. He was here to do his job. He had a duty to, perform. Inside the station, things were strangely quiet as well. The air was thick with dust. The logbook sat open on the desk, the last entry frozen on its pages. The flickering light above the radio hummed softly, but there was no noise, no static, no voice. The station was abandoned. It had been abandoned, but Derek didn't know that. He hadn't read the warnings in the logbook. He didn't know the dark history of this place. He settled in quickly, unpacking his gear and setting up for the night. The wind howled faintly outside, but it didn't feel like the storm from earlier. It felt different, like something was watching. He glanced out the window into the darkness. Nothing, at least, nothing that he could see. Hours passed. Derek spent most of the time reading through the outdated manuals and taking inventory of the equipment. Nothing too taxing, just the kind of boring tasks that came with the night shift. The wind outside picked up, rustling the trees with a strange urgency. And still, no birds, no sounds of life. Nothing but the howl of the wind, sharp and cruel, against the station's windows. Then the radio crackled to life. For a split second, Derek's heart stopped. It had been silent for hours, but when he reached for the radio, his fingers brushed against the dial, and it stopped. Nothing. The room went cold. He stood there, unsure of what to do, the hairs on his neck standing on end. He took a deep breath, trying to shake the creeping sense of unease that was slowly building in his chest. But then, again, a voice. So faint, so weak, a whisper through the static like a forgotten prayer. "Help me." Derek froze. His heart pounded in his chest. The voice was so familiar. It was the voice of someone desperate, someone lost. He leaned in closer, straining to hear. "It's watching me." The static grew louder, the voice drowned in a sea of crackling noise. He pressed the button on the radio, calling into the darkness. "This is Ranger Derek. Who's out there? Are you in trouble? I'm at the station. I can help." For a moment, there was only static. Then something shifted in the air. The temperature dropped. A soft whisper echoed in his ear, but when he turned, no one was there. His pulse quickened. Then the voice returned. "I can't move. Please, someone help me." Derek's breath caught in his throat. The voice was so faint, but it was clear. He had heard this before. He glanced over at the radio, where the crackling continued. He pressed the button again, this time more urgently. "Who are you? Where are you? What's happening? Please respond." Nothing but the soft hiss of static in return. And then, a new voice, unmistakable, clear as day. "If you hear it, don't answer. Don't look outside." Derek's blood ran cold. His fingers froze on the radio dial. It wasn't the static. It wasn't the storm. That voice, he knew it. It was Michael's voice. The radio's light flickered once, then cut out completely. For a second, Derek couldn't move. His mind raced, the warnings, the whispers, the stories he had heard about. The station. All those disappearances, those rangers who never came back. The ones whose names had been forgotten. He grabbed the logbook, flipping through it with trembling hands, and then he found it. The last entry, Michael's handwriting. "If you hear it, don't answer, don't look outside." It was there, the truth. Michael had written it, had felt the same terror. And now Derek was trapped. The wind howled outside again, louder this time. But something else had joined it. A deep, unsettling rumble, as though the earth itself were groaning. The darkness outside was thickening, pressing in against the windows. Derek's breath caught in his throat. He didn't look outside. He didn't answer. But the radio, it crackled back to life, and it was calling his name. The cold had seeped into Derek's bones. The chill of the mountain wind now pressed against his skin, sending ripples of icy dread through him. It wasn't just the temperature that made him shiver. It was the presence. The heavy, suffocating presence that had crawled inside the station, clinging to the walls like something alive. something that fed on the fear and loneliness of the place. It was suffocating him now. The radio crackled again, breaking the oppressive silence that had settled over him. His fingers brushed against the worn dials as though they had a mind of their own. The station had been abandoned, but now it felt like it was alive, and the entity, it, was watching him. Derek. The voice came from the static again. No mistake. It was clear, desperate, familiar. Derek. Please. It was Michael's voice. Derek's stomach twisted, bile rising in his throat. His hand trembled on the radio. The words of the last transmission echoed in his mind, drowning out all coherent thought. If you hear it, don't answer. Don't. Look outside, but the whispers, the voice. It was Michael's, the same plea for help, the same crackling desperation. Derek couldn't ignore it. He didn't know what else to do. Michael, Derek called softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Michael, where are you? What happened? The static buzzed with urgency, the hum growing louder until it nearly drowned him. Then there was a pause, a long, suffocating silence. And then, I couldn't escape. Derek's blood ran cold. That was not a voice that was meant to be heard. It wasn't human anymore. It was something else. Something changed. The radio hissed once more, and then through the fog of static came a garbled, almost mechanical voice. You're next, Derek. The station is hungry. The ground beneath him trembled lightly. The walls shuddered. And there, at the edges of his vision, Derek saw it. A flicker in the shadows. Movement. Something. Someone. A figure obscured by the darkness, shifting between the narrow slivers of moonlight that filtered through the dusty windows. Derek's breath caught in his chest. He wasn't alone. The figure stepped closer, slowly, deliberately, as though it was savoring the moment. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. It was more like a shadow, a blurred reflection of something that had once been a person. The outline was broken, jagged, as though parts of it were slipping away, fading into the darkness like an old photograph that was being slowly consumed by time. The closer it came, the more its features began to emerge from the darkness. A face. Michael. No, not Michael, not exactly. The eyes, those eyes, were hollow, empty, black as night. The skin stretched thin and taut, as though the flesh was peeling away, revealing something that no longer resembled a man. The face was gaunt, sunken, its mouth twisted in a grimace that made Derek's heart race. The radio crackled again, as if amplifying the horrors before him. Derek. You shouldn't have listened. You shouldn't have come. It was Michael's voice, but something darker, something worse had taken hold of it. It didn't just speak anymore. It crawled into the air, hanging like a thick fog, filling the room with dread. Derek stumbled backward, his legs weak with terror. He tried to speak, tried to force the words out, but his mouth felt dry. His thoughts were disjointed, his mind flooded with panic. He had to escape. He had to leave. But he couldn't. The door. He rushed toward it, but before he could even lay a hand on the handle, the figure was there, blocking his way. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, like a broken marionette. It stretched out a long, skeletal hand, and for a moment, Derek's mind refused to process what he was seeing. The shadow was standing in front of him, not as an apparition, but as something solid, something real. Its cold fingers reached out, brushing against his cheek. The touch was electric, a sharp jolt of freezing energy that shot straight through his spine. Derek recoiled, his skin crawling, and in that moment, he realized this was no ghost. This was something alive, something that had once been human. The figure opened its mouth, its jaw unhinging in a grotesque way that made Derek's stomach churn. You belong to us now." Derek's heart slammed against his ribs. The things. Breath was a cold wind that filled his lungs, dragging him down into a nightmare he couldn't wake from. His legs buckled beneath him, and he fell to the floor, his face pressed against the cold wood of the station. He was not alone. There were others. They were all around him now, their forms flickering in the darkness, fading in and out like reflections in a cracked mirror. They weren't fully human. They had been twisted, their bodies broken and reshaped into something unrecognizable. But Derek could still see the remnants of their past selves, their eyes, their voices, trapped inside, unable to escape, trapped in this place, trapped in the station. The voices began to rise, overlapping, all calling to him. They all spoke at once, and the words came faster, more urgently, until the sound was a continuous, maddening drone. "Derek, help us. We couldn't escape. You can't either. It's too late." The shadows closed in, their cold breath brushing against him like whispers of the dead. "It's too late. It's too late." And then, something else. A shadow moved past Derek, the outline of a man, tall, lean, familiar. It was the ranger who had left the last entry, the last warning. "You can't run, Derek." His face was gone, just like Michael's. His form was no longer human, just a hollow shell, a broken figure. A part of the entity now. Derek reached for him, his hand trembling. But the figure stepped back, disappearing into the darkness like smoke. And that was when he heard it. The radio crackled once more. The voice was soft, clear, and more chilling than anything before. "You should have listened. You should have never come." The shadow closed in on Derek, their whispers growing louder, more desperate, as the walls began to close in. The station was shifting, warping, becoming something other, something ancient, something hungry. Derek tried to scream, but the voice, in his mind, the entity, drowned him out. His vision blurred, his body trembled, his world turned cold, and then, just like that, the darkness swallowed him whole. The air in the station grew thick, more suffocating with each passing second. Derek's senses were overloaded. His head spun as the shadows seemed to stretch and contract, their shapes shifting like black smoke that could never be touched. He had heard the whispers in the dark, but now they were more than just voices. They were thoughts, invading his mind, worming their way into his skull. "You'll join us now. There's no escape." The words were soft, seductive. They pulled at him like invisible threads, dragging him toward the void that lay beyond the walls of the ranger station. It was no longer a place, it was a trap, a living thing, and Derek was the next piece it would claim. He couldn't move. His body was frozen, limbs heavy as lead, his chest rising and falling in short, panicked gasps. The shadows wrapped around him like a cocoon, and he could feel them curling through his skin, settling deep in his bones, erasing him. The last sliver of his mind screamed for him to fight, to resist, but there was nothing. The station was everywhere now. The walls pulsed with a dark, sickly energy. They were watching him, listening. They could see his every thought. The radio crackled, louder this time, the sound deafening. "Derek, come closer. We have waited so long." He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the noise, the horror that pressed in around him. But it was impossible. The air was thick with something vile, something that stank of decay and rot. A gust of wind blew through the cracked windows, carrying the scent of death. When Derek opened his eyes again, he could see them, the Rangers, not as they had been, not as they had lived. No, they were different. They were something else entirely. They stood in the corners of the room, their forms almost translucent, their faces gaunt and hollow, their eyes wide with a kind of horrified knowledge. They had been consumed by the station, twisted into something inhuman, yet somehow still aware of their fate. One of them stepped forward, its features barely recognizable. Michael. His face was an eerie reflection of his former self, like looking at a corroded photograph, the image falling apart. Derek wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. Michael's mouth moved, but the words that came out weren't his own. They were the entity's voice, that ancient, malevolent presence that had consumed them all. You will be us. You will forget who you were. You will hunger. You will feed. The words were dark, insidious. They crawled into Derek's mind, burrowing deep inside. No, not like this. He refused to become like them. He wouldn't give in, but there was nowhere to run. The shadows were closing in tighter, thicker now, pooling around him like ink spilling across a page. They were drowning him, suffocating him. His body trembled with the pull of the station. It was hungry. It was always hungry. Then came the sound. A distant thrum, a hum so low it resonated through the very ground beneath Derek's feet. The station shook. The walls groaned with a sound like the cracking of bone. Something ancient stirred beneath the floorboards, its hunger rising. The shadows hissed and writhed, feeding on the fear, the dread that Derek could no longer suppress. His chest tightened, the weight of the entity's influence pressing down on him. He was slipping away. Suddenly, a jarring noise broke through. The suffocating air, the radio, it crackled to life again. You have been chosen, Derek. Derek's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't Michael's voice anymore. The voice on the radio was different, new, and it echoed with a dark resonance that made his very soul tremble. It was the entity speaking directly to him now, through the P device, its malevolent whispers growing clearer. We are many. We are Legion. We are the station. You will join us, and together we will feast. We will never be alone again. The walls trembled again, and the floor beneath Derek's feet split, the cracks snaking toward him like veins in a corpse. He looked down and saw it. The floor was bleeding. It was oozing something dark and viscous, like the very essence of the station being excreted from its bones. The darkness was rising. Derek had to make a choice. He remembered the logbook. He remembered Michael's last words, the warning etched in his mind. Don't look outside, don't answer. But it was too late for that. The entity had already answered for him, and then Derek saw something, or perhaps it was the entity showing him, pulling back the veil of his mind to reveal the truth. The station wasn't just a place of isolation. It wasn't a place of nature, untouched by man. It was alive, and it had been alive long before the Rangers had arrived. The entity that haunted the station was ancient, older than the mountains, older than the world itself. It had fed on the souls of those who wandered too close to its hunger. It had devoured them, transforming them into its servants. It had always been watching. The walls, those oppressive, rotting walls, were the bones of the station, the marrow of a creature whose appetite could never be sated. It would consume them all. And once it was done, it would call the next. Derek could feel the entity's influence growing inside of him, pulsing like a beating heart. His skin began to itch, the sensation spreading through his veins. His vision blurred. The shadows pulled at him. His mind grew hazy, his memories slipping through his fingers like sand. And then, in the distance, there was a flash. The door. It was still there. For a moment, a single moment, the door was real again. The threshold to the outside world. It was his chance. But just as he moved, just as his body screamed at him to run, the entity's voice shattered the silence once more. You cannot leave. You will not leave. We are one." The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, and Derek felt something snap inside of him. His vision went black. When he opened his eyes again, the station was still. There was no wind, no sound, only the slow, rhythmic thrum of the walls around him. The shadows were everywhere, creeping in every corner. And then he felt it, the hunger. He felt the call. He was no longer Derek. He was part of the station. The cycle had claimed him. The radio crackled once, more, its voice echoing in the silence. The feast continues. The station was quiet now. Too quiet. Derek, no, whatever he had become, stood in the center of the room, his eyes vacant, the once familiar weight of his body now feeling like something distant. It was as though he no longer recognized himself, as if he had lost touch with who he once was. His skin was pale, nearly translucent, his limbs stiff, moving only at the beckoning of the shadows around him. There were no thoughts in his mind. No fear, no pain. The hunger. It was a gnawing, insatiable thing that had taken root deep in his chest. He could feel it like a void, a yawning pit that would never be filled. The hunger wasn't just for flesh, it was for souls, for the essence of life itself. The voices of those who had come before him, whispered in the air, their words like cold breath against his ear. They were there, in the darkness, never far, always waiting for the next. "We are the feast," they whispered, "and you are part of us now." Derek's hands, no longer his hands, shifted toward the radio. His fingers, skeletal and twisted, hovered above the device as if guided by some unseen force, some ancient will. The radio crackled, and in the silence it seemed to speak to him, not just through the air, but through his very soul. The call is constant. The feast is never ending. Derek, now nothing more than a shadow, a reflection of his former self, could feel it deep inside him. He could hear the hunger in the radio, the pulsing, endless echo of the station's cravings. The station, he realized, was alive, not just as a structure, but as a living entity, a thing of hunger and darkness that needed to feed forever. The very mountains around it were merely its bones, its flesh, the rivers, its veins, the skies, its breath. The station was more than just a place. It was a trap, a mechanism designed to lure in the living and consume their souls one by one. Derek could feel the door. It was there, somewhere, just beyond his reach. The door he had seen, the door that had once been the last hope of escape. It was still there, somewhere in the back of his mind, teasing him with the possibility of release. He wanted to run, wanted to break free, to escape the cycle of horror that had now consumed him. But the hunger was too strong. He couldn't fight it anymore. His flesh was gone, replaced by something darker, colder, more empty. The radio hummed again. "You are a part of the cycle now. The next one will come, and then you will feast." A flash of movement caught Derek's attention. A shape, a figure, another ranger perhaps. No, this one was different. This one wasn't like the others. This one still had life in their eyes. There was still something human about them. Derek reached for them, his fingers moving with an unnatural swiftness. But as he did, the figure stepped back, disappearing into the shadows with a silent cry of warning. "Don't let it take you. Don't answer the call." But it was too late. The ground trembled beneath Derek's feet, a low rumble that made the walls shake with a violent force. The air grew thick with the weight of the station's presence, as if it were about to burst from its seams. The hunger, the endless need, was rising to a crescendo. The radio began to speak, but this time it wasn't the soft, whispering voice of the entity. It was louder, more urgent, as if the station was speaking directly to him. "There is no escape. No one escapes. Not Michael. Not you. Not the next. We are the station, and we will always feed. The walls of the station groaned, their ancient bones creaking in protest. The shadows writhed, growing ever thicker, pulsating with energy that seemed to bleed into everything, every corner, every crevice, every thought. The entity was alive in the walls, in the very foundation of the building, and Derek was now a part of it, a cog in the machine that could never stop. Suddenly, the radio spoke again, but this time, the voice was different. "There's always a choice," the voice said, "but you must choose quickly." Derek's head snapped toward the radio. The shadows in the room shifted as if responding to the words. Was it trying to give him a way out? "There is always one who can break the cycle," the voice continued. "One who can set it right. One who can walk away if they choose." The radio hummed with an eerie rhythm, as if waiting for Derek to understand something. The door, the one he had seen in his mind. It was real. It was still there. Derek felt the pull, the call of the door, the promise of escape. But then a vision flashed before his eyes. Michael, the skeletal figure of the ranger who had once been a man, now trapped in the station, his soul consumed, his body twisted into something unrecognizable. The cycle. It would never end. Derek's mind raced. Could he break free? Could he be the one to stop it? Or was he doomed to become just another voice, another face lost in the endless cycle, forever calling out on the radio to the next victim, just as the previous rangers had done before him? The hunger surged through his chest again. The whispers, louder now. The cycle was pulling him back, dragging him toward the shadow, toward the station's heart. The door was closing. The shadows were closing in. He could feel the shift. The world around him seemed to tilt, like a ship sinking into the abyss. The station was beginning to collapse, and all that was left was the hunger, the darkness. And then he saw it. In the fleeting seconds before he was swallowed whole by the shadows, Derek made his choice. He did not turn to face the door. He did not attempt to escape. He didn't even fight. He answered the radio. He spoke the words he could never take back. "I'm here." The station fell silent. The radio clicked off, and the cycle continued. The end. And so, the cycle repeats. The next ranger will arrive. The next will answer the call, and the station will always be hungry. Questions linger. Who will be the next victim? What happens to those who choose? Can anyone ever truly escape the feast of shadows?